The boundless reaches of the Central Asian steppes, stretching from the Alai Mountains to the shores of the Caspian Sea, stirred with silence and wind for millennia. These were not lands of cities or palaces, but of wind-scoured grasslands, shifting light, and the rhythmic pulse of hooves. It was here, amidst this stark, infinite landscape, that one of history's most enigmatic peoples emerged, the Huns. The steppe is not merely a backdrop, it is a force. It shapes those who dwell upon it. Here, the horse is not a tool but a companion, the bow is not a weapon but an extension of the self. Life depends not on walls or fields but on movement, instinct, and the cycles of sky and season. In this world of horizons without end, only those who could live with the land, not against it, endured. It was in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE that a wave of nomadic peoples began to move westward from the heart of Asia. Among them were those we would come to know as the Huns. Their name, later to become a byword for terror and ruin in Roman lands, had not yet formed in the records of civilization. Their story begins not in chronicles, but in bones and bronze, scattered beneath the soil from Mongolia to the Ural foothills. Understanding their origins is like piecing together smoke. The Huns left no written language, no archives or official seals. What remains are traces, burial mounds filled with iron bits, bronze cauldrons with mushroom-like handles, skulls shaped by artificial deformation. These are the fragments from which their past must be recovered. Much of our earliest insight comes from far to the east, from Chinese historians, particularly the grand annalists of the Han dynasty. They speak of the Xiongnu, a formidable nomadic confederation that clashed with China for centuries. The Xiongnu, whose empire stretched across the Mongolian steppe from the 3rd century BCE to the early 1st century CE, possessed a political and military structure eerily similar to that later observed among the Huns. They too had a supreme leader, the Chanyu, whose title echoes the Hun Khan. Their lands were divided into right and left wings, their society was ruled by a hierarchy of warrior chiefs. When the Xiongnu fell to internal strife and Chinese pressure around 91 CE, their northern branch disappeared westward, fading from Chinese records. But archaeological signs begin to appear around this time in regions further west, in the Volga steppe, the Ural basin. A new presence. A new pattern. Some scholars believe the displaced Xiongnu carried with them their military traditions, their societal structures, and perhaps even the name that would, centuries later, be feared from Constantinople to Orleans. The steppes, ever a corridor of movement, bore the weight of climate and pressure. Tree ring data and glacial cores tell of cooling in Central Asia in these centuries, less rainfall, poorer pastures, and mounting desperation. Such environmental hardship may have driven waves of migration, setting off a chain reaction of displacement and expansion. In this crucible of wind and motion, shaped by cold seasons and long horizons, the Huns began their slow, invisible journey, westward, onward, not yet the scourge of empires, but already something more than mere wanderers. To understand the Huns, one must reach not only across vast landscapes but through the fog of forgotten centuries. Their sudden appearance on the Roman frontier in the late 4th century startled the chroniclers of the age, yet they did not spring from nothing. Before they thundered down upon the Danube or encircled Constantinople with shadowy tents, they were already an echo, a continuation of ancient patterns etched deep into the soil of Eurasia. Centuries earlier, the Xiongnu had challenged the might of Han China. Their horsemen rode with deadly bows and iron discipline. Their confederation, forged through conquest and kinship, mirrored what we would see later among the Huns. Their defeats at the hands of Chinese generals like Dou Xian fractured their unity, and by the end of the 1st century CE, a large faction had fled westward. Chinese records fall silent, but the steppe speaks a different language, that of migration. Archaeological traces from the Aral Sea region and the Kazakh steppe show a sudden disruption in cultural patterns around the 2nd century CE. Burial practices change, skulls appear elongated, shaped in infancy through deliberate binding. This trait, once unknown in the region, became a defining feature of Hun elites, noted centuries later by Roman observers. These modified skulls, stretched and unnatural, became a symbol of status, a visual reminder of difference and dominion. Alongside them, bronze cauldrons begin to emerge in distant burial sites, wide and shallow, with handles shaped like mushroom caps. These cauldrons were not used for cooking alone, they held ceremonial significance, placed with care among the grave goods of chiefs and warriors. Their distribution marks the path of movement, from Mongolia through the Altai and into the Pontic steppe, tracing a migration that was as cultural as it was physical. Other signs followed. The composite bow, a marvel of steppe warfare, appears west of the Ural Mountains. Crafted from layers of horn, sinew, and wood, it could launch arrows with deadly precision from horseback. Its asymmetric design, with a shorter lower limb, allowed for ease of use while riding, a clear evolution toward mounted combat supremacy. Trilobate arrowheads found in Hun graves show an understanding of lethality refined through centuries of conflict. Even the horses told a story. Bits and stirrups discovered in graves reveal a sophisticated knowledge of equine control. The rigid stirrup, a later innovation, began to spread in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, first among eastern nomads, then westward. It was a revolution in mounted warfare, giving riders unprecedented stability. The Huns, by the time they reached the Roman world, were already masters of mounted archery, a skill honed not in battlefields, but across generations of hunting and raiding in the open steppe. Cultural synthesis became their hallmark. Metalwork from Hun-associated burials combines motifs from the Scythians, swirling animals in combat, with the cloisonné techniques of Chinese artisans and the geometries of Persian design. They were not isolated predators but participants in a vast, interwoven network of trade and tribute that spanned from the Yellow River to the Danube. The emerging Hun confederations were not a single tribe, but a confluence, a braided stream of displaced Xiongnu, absorbed Sarmatians, and local steppe peoples brought into alliance or subjugation. Their leaders were not born to a single bloodline but rose through merit and allegiance. This was not a nation. It was a machine of motion. And so, long before they crossed into Roman lands, the Huns had already become something formidable. Not merely horsemen or raiders, but heirs to a lineage of empire that had once stared down China itself. Their footsteps, silent but firm, pressed ever westward, through valleys and over rivers, toward the dawn of their reckoning with the West. By the 3rd century CE, the steppe was once again in turmoil. Climate stress, population shifts, and the lingering echo of Xiongnu collapse had created a chain reaction that rippled across Eurasia. In these waves of change, a new force was quietly coalescing, not through the establishment of cities or capitals, but through alliance, conquest, and sheer mobility. This force would become known as the Huns. Their movements were not sudden storms, but rather the slow advance of thunderclouds, gathering force as they passed over the lands of the Alans and Sarmatians. These Indo-Iranian peoples, once dominant in the regions north of the Caucasus and around the Caspian, had long formed a buffer between the Eastern nomads and the Roman world. But in time, even their cavalry, feared and famed, could not withstand the rising tide of Hun expansion. The Alans, perhaps the most militarily adept of their neighbors, were both absorbed and displaced. Some were pressed into service under Hun leaders, forming auxiliary cavalry units that bolstered Hun raiding strength. Others fled westward, scattering into the Gothic kingdoms and further into Gaul. The pattern would repeat, conflict followed by fragmentation, and then absorption. The Huns, like a forest fire, fed on what they encountered, growing stronger with each encounter. Archaeology again reveals the contours of this transformation. In the Pontic steppe, new grave forms appear, rectangular pits, oriented east to west, with the dead laid in a flexed position, side-lying, often accompanied by dismembered horse remains. These were not random burials but ritualized, intentional. The horse, central to the life of the steppe warrior, was given in death, its head placed with care to face the human it had served. Whether as transport for the soul or as an offering to the spirits of the earth, these acts speak of a belief system rooted in animism and the cycles of the natural world. Bronze mirrors found in graves suggest a fascination with reflection and vision, not merely in the physical sense, but perhaps the metaphysical. Pottery vessels, coarse and undecorated, contrast sharply with the painted wares of neighboring cultures. These were a people who valued function and endurance over beauty, yet in their metalwork, inlaid with garnet and glass, we glimpse a desire for splendor, for symbolism, for the projection of power. By the mid-3rd century, the signs of Hun presence had reached the western edge of the Eurasian steppe. Their warriors, equipped with composite bows, lasso ropes, and heavy sabers, had begun testing the fringes of Gothic territory. This brought them into contact with the Tervings and Greuthungs, two major branches of the Gothic peoples who occupied lands between the Don and Dniester rivers. Initially, the Goths viewed the newcomers with curiosity. Nomads from the east were not uncommon. But the Huns were not like the others. Their tactics were fluid, their assaults unrelenting. Unlike the Germanic warriors, who favored set-piece battle and shield walls, the Huns fought like shadows, appearing, striking, vanishing. They attacked not just armies but settlements, supply lines, and morale itself. Contemporary Roman sources, though limited, begin to notice this growing threat beyond the limes. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing later in the 4th century, would describe them as barely human, likening their speech to the barking of animals and their habits to beasts. Yet beneath the invective lies a hint of fear. Rome was beginning to sense that something terrible was approaching from beyond the frontiers. Something that could not be reasoned with, bribed, or contained. In truth, the Huns were not mindless destroyers. Their leaders sought wealth and power, yes, but they also understood the importance of negotiation, of tribute, of manipulating the rivalries among Rome's client states. They were learning not only how to ride and fight, but how to rule. It was in this crucible of Gothic resistance, Roman arrogance, and nomadic ambition that the Huns began to take their true shape. Not merely a people in motion, but a rising force that would, within a few decades, alter the balance of power across an entire continent. By the closing decades of the 4th century, the pressure of Hun expansion had grown unbearable for many of the peoples in their path. The Goths, long-standing inhabitants of the lands between the Dniester and Don rivers, now found themselves face to face with a force they neither understood nor could withstand. It was not merely the strength of Hun arms that shattered them, it was the relentlessness, the unpredictability, the terror of facing an enemy that seemed to come from the wind itself. The Greuthungi and Tervings, the two main Gothic confederations, had until this point maintained a fragile balance between Roman influence to the south and steppe volatility to the east. But the arrival of the Huns upset that balance beyond repair. The Greuthungi were struck first. Their lands, sprawling across what is now southern Ukraine, were invaded with brutal speed. Settlements burned, nobles fell, and communities scattered. Some were absorbed into the Hun dominion, others, in desperation, fled. The flight of the Goths marked a watershed moment in European history. In 376 CE, a vast number of Terving Goths approached the Danube, pleading with the Eastern Roman Empire for asylum. Famine and fear compelled them to seek protection within Roman borders. Emperor Valens, ruling from Constantinople, agreed to their request, but the process of relocation was poorly managed, corrupted by greed and incompetence. Roman officials extorted the starving Goths, demanding their children in exchange for dog meat. Resentment festered. Within 2 years, this tension exploded into open rebellion. At Adrianople in 378 CE, the Gothic army annihilated a Roman field force and killed Emperor Valens himself. This was not a mere border skirmish, it was the death knell of Roman invincibility. Never again would the Eastern Roman Empire feel secure behind its riverine frontiers. And behind the Gothic migrations, ever driving forward, loomed the Huns. It is here that the Huns first directly entered the consciousness of Roman chroniclers. Though still not fully understood, they were now recognized as the storm from which other nations fled. Ammianus Marcellinus, though never having seen them himself, described the Huns in vivid, fearful language, short of stature, ugly of face, yet terrifying in war. He spoke of their inhuman speed, their lack of permanent homes, and their capacity to live as if born of the saddle. Though hyperbolic, his words capture the essential truth of how the Huns were perceived, as outsiders beyond comprehension, products of a different world. Their way of life, entirely mobile, anchored to horses and pasture, defied the Roman ideal of civilization. Yet these same traits gave the Huns advantages Rome could not replicate. In the years following Adrianople, the Huns continued to push westward, exerting pressure not only on the Goths but on other steppe and forest peoples, the Alans, the Sarmatians, even Germanic tribes like the Heruli and Gepids. Many of these were forced to migrate, compounding the instability along Rome's borders. The Great Migration, as later historians would call it, was not a single event, but a cascade, and at its origin stood the Huns. They had not yet crossed into Roman territory in force. Not yet. But they were already shaping the destiny of empires. In the halls of Constantinople and Ravenna, their name was whispered as a growing menace. In the forests of Germania, among the Syrian Rugians, it was spoken with dread. And in the steppe, in the shifting camps and wide valleys, new leaders were rising, learning the weight of gold, the value of diplomacy, and the blood price of ambition. The Huns were no longer a migrating tribe. They were becoming an empire. By the dawn of the 5th century, the Huns had evolved beyond their early nomadic identity. No longer merely a roaming people on the edges of civilization, they had become the architects of a new power, fluid, elusive, but unmistakably imperial in ambition. Though they possessed no stone cities, no temples or inscriptions, they ruled not through monuments but through motion, through fear, and through the awe of their enemies. Their strength lay not only in their horses or weapons, but in their ability to adapt. Wherever they advanced, they absorbed. Defeated tribes were not eradicated, they were repurposed. Gothic, Alanic, and Sarmatian warriors joined Hun armies, often willingly. Their skills were useful, their knowledge of Roman frontiers invaluable. In this, the Huns resembled an empire more than a horde, a coalition of peoples bound by loyalty to a central command, flexible and fast. Their settlements remained mobile. They did not build towns in the Roman sense, but established vast encampments, moving with the seasons, with grazing, with need. These tented cities, sprawling, unpredictable, defied Roman understanding. Yet they functioned with surprising order. Livestock herds were managed with precision. Smiths, leatherworkers, and armorers worked in the open. Within the chieftain circles, emissaries came and went, bearing tribute or negotiation. The Roman Empire, especially in the East, now found itself paying a price for peace. Hun raids along the Danube had grown so fierce, so costly, that emperors turned to diplomacy. Treaties were signed, gold was promised, and paid. Annual subsidies flowed into the hands of Hun leaders, first to buy their silence, later to secure their cooperation against other barbarian threats. But each payment bred contempt, not loyalty. The Huns understood tribute as a token of fear, and fear, to them, was power. Among the Hun elite, a new generation of leaders emerged, cunning, calculating, and increasingly aware of Rome's internal weaknesses. They saw the division between East and West, the rivalries of generals, the reliance on mercenary forces. And they learned quickly. The Huns began to engage not only as raiders, but as negotiators. They demanded titles, lands, hostages, and seats at the imperial table. Yet their military core remained unchanged. Hun warfare was a mastery of the mobile. They did not fight to hold territory, but to disrupt, to drain, to unnerve. A typical attack was swift and bewildering, columns of light cavalry striking from multiple directions, retreating, then returning. Their bows, small, recurved, made from layers of horn and sinew, could pierce armor from horseback. Their sabers, heavy and slightly curved, were deadly in close combat. The psychological impact of their methods was immense. Roman soldiers, trained for formation combat, found themselves helpless in open fields. Fortified cities became refuges not just for civilians but for troops unable to counter the Huns' movement. Stories spread of entire provinces laid waste in days, of cities surrounded before a message could be sent for help. Panic became a weapon. At the same time, within their own society, the Huns remained deeply hierarchical. Authority flowed from war chiefs, but the central figure was the High King, a man whose rule was less hereditary than charismatic. He led not through law, but through loyalty, gifts, and fear. In the early years of the 5th century, that title passed to two brothers, Octa and Ruga. They would rule in tandem, expanding Hun influence further into Europe. It was under Ruga, in particular, that relations with the Roman world shifted dramatically. The Eastern Empire agreed to recognize his authority in the region and pledged annual payments in gold, the beginning of a long and uneasy partnership. Ruga understood the currency of diplomacy, but never hesitated to unleash violence when terms were broken. Rome, by its own fear, was teaching the Huns the price of compliance. The steppe had borne many peoples. But now, under leaders like Ruga, it bore something else, an entity that could threaten Rome not from beyond its walls, but from within its politics. The Huns, masters of the horizon, were preparing to step fully into the drama of empire. The name of Ruga, or Rua, as some Roman chroniclers styled him, marked a turning point in the history of the Huns. With his rise in the early 5th century, the Hun Confederation moved from a force of chaotic migration to a defined political power. Ruga was no ordinary chieftain. He was the first Hun ruler to be recognized by the Roman Empire not merely as a threat, but as an authority. Under him, the Huns became a kingdom in all but name. Little is known of Ruga's early life, but by the time of his rule, he commanded a formidable network of vassals and allied tribes stretching from the Tisa River in modern-day Hungary to the northern Black Sea coast. His brother Octa ruled in the west, likely from a mobile court near the upper Danube. Together they controlled a space greater than any barbarian leader before them, an empire of motion, tethered not by roads or walls, but by oath and terror. Ruga's approach to Rome was calculated. He recognized the value of playing diplomacy against violence. In 432 CE, when the Western Roman general Aetius faced rebellion and needed troops, it was Ruga who supplied Hun auxiliaries to crush the revolt. This act was not one of friendship, but of investment. In return, Ruga demanded political recognition, tribute, and assurance that his interests would be honored. The Western Empire complied, for now. It was in the east, however, that Ruga exerted the greatest pressure. The Danube frontier had become porous, the once proud Roman defenses stretched thin. Towns lived in fear of Hun raids. Cities trembled at the rumor of their approach. The court in Constantinople, under Emperor Theodosius II, found itself in a humiliating position, negotiating not from strength, but from fear. In 435 CE, Ruga demanded a treaty that would bind the Eastern Empire to an annual payment of gold, some accounts suggest £350 per year, in exchange for peace. The treaty also required the return of Hun refugees, the restriction of asylum to political enemies, and the opening of markets for Hun merchants. This was not simply extortion, it was the articulation of statecraft. The Huns were shaping the rules of engagement with one of the greatest powers of the age. Roman historians would later record this with disdain. They wrote of savages dictating terms to emperors. But the reality was more complex. Ruger understood that gold was not merely wealth, it was leverage. Each coin paid in tribute was a signal of Roman weakness. Each shipment carried to his court reinforced the loyalty of his followers. His generosity to allies, his ruthlessness to defectors, all of it was financed from imperial coffers. The balance, however, was delicate. When the Eastern Court failed to meet terms, or when border officials acted without sanction, Ruger responded with raids. Swift, brutal, and precise, these assaults devastated frontier towns, reminding the emperors that the peace they paid for was always provisional. Then, in the year 434 or 435, Ruger died, suddenly, and without warning. Some Roman sources hinted at divine punishment, others at internal betrayal. The truth remains unknown. But what followed was a moment of uncertainty that quickly resolved into something far more ominous. Power passed not to another cautious negotiator, but to his nephews, two brothers named Bleda and Attila. They would not be content with tribute alone. They would ask not just for gold, but for fear itself. When Ruger died, the Huns stood at a crossroad. His rule had solidified their presence as a formidable force in Eastern Europe. He had mastered the language of diplomacy, used gold as a weapon, and made emperors bow behind closed doors. But with his sudden passing, uncertainty stirred in the camps. Would the unity he forged collapse? Would the empire of tents and oaths dissolve into the feuds of chiefs? It did not. Instead, two figures stepped forward, Bleda and Attila, the sons of Mundzuk, Ruger's brother. Their ascension was swift, undisputed. In the Hun tradition, power often passed not by blood alone, but by strength and consensus among the warrior nobility. The two brothers shared the kingship, a pattern familiar from earlier Hun and Xiongnu practices. The realm was likely divided along geographic or tribal lines, but the brothers ruled together in name and will. At first, it was Bleda who seemed the senior. He was the elder, more visible in diplomatic correspondences. Roman ambassadors, including the historian Priscus, recorded his presence as dominant in early encounters. Yet even then, Attila, younger, leaner, and far more enigmatic, stood close at hand. His silence, his manner, hinted at something that Roman envoys found unsettling. Priscus, who later met him in person, would describe a man of few words, piercing eyes, and a gravity that drew the court around him like iron to a lodestone. The early years of their joint reign followed Ruger's pattern, negotiation laced with menace. In 435, the Treaty of Margus was reaffirmed with the Eastern Roman Empire. The Huns agreed to peace in exchange for increased tribute, now doubled to £700 of gold per year. Margus, modern-day Porovac in Serbia, became a key diplomatic outpost, the place where terms were hammered out and emissaries exchanged. But peace with the Huns was always tenuous. The Romans, perhaps emboldened by internal stability or believing the Huns were distracted by their own politics, soon violated the terms. A Roman bishop crossed into Hun territory and desecrated royal Hun graves. The offense was grave. It was not just a religious insult, it was a spiritual attack. In nomadic tradition, the dead were part of the living world, guardians, ancestors, symbols of continuity. To violate their rest was to invite wrath. Attila and Bleda responded in kind. In 441, while the Eastern Roman armies were occupied in the south with naval campaigns, the Huns swept across the Danube. Their speed was terrifying. Fortress towns such as Viminatium and Naissus fell quickly. Walls crumbled before siege engines and fire, defenders broke under the storm of arrows. Roman sources speak of entire cities burned to ash, of rivers choked with the dead. Yet the Huns did not remain to hold territory. Their goal was not colonization, it was devastation and submission. By 442, the Eastern Court, reeling from defeats, begged for peace. The Huns withdrew, not out of weakness, but satisfaction. They had reasserted their terms. The flow of gold resumed. But the balance between the brothers began to shift. Bleda, perhaps more cautious, sought to maintain the rhythm of tribute and diplomacy. Attila, restless, watched and waited. His ambitions were larger. He saw the cracks widening in both Eastern and Western Roman realms. He sensed that the time had come not just to extort from Rome, but to challenge it. In 445, Bleda vanished from the record. Some claimed he died of illness. Others whispered of betrayal. A few later chroniclers with no love for Attila declared flatly that he was murdered by his brother. No certainty survives. But after 445, Attila stood alone. He was now sole ruler of the Huns, a master of the steppes, scourge of empires. The world would soon come to know his name. When Attila emerged as the sole ruler of the Huns, the world tilted on its axis. Gone were the hesitations of shared authority. With Bleda dead, by fate or by design, Attila no longer needed to navigate consensus. He ruled absolutely, and he ruled with vision. This was no longer a confederation of steppe warriors. It was an empire in motion, with Attila at its heart like a storm given form. Contemporaries feared him before they understood him. Roman chroniclers, unable to reconcile his simplicity with his power, described him with a blend of horror and awe. Priscus, who dined at Attila's court, was struck by the ruler's modesty, plain clothes, wooden drinking cups, no ostentation. Yet around him stood nobles robed in gold and gems, trembling with deference. This contrast was no accident. Attila projected strength by rejecting luxury. He needed no throne, no palace, to command. His capital, if it could be called that, was no marble city, but a great encampment somewhere in the Pannonian basin, perhaps near the Tisa River. There, tents and wooden halls stretched across the plain. Envoys from Constantinople and Ravenna walked among yurts and horse pens, past blacksmiths and warrior retinues, toward the longhouse where Attila held court. His rule, though rooted in the nomadic traditions of the steppe, had all the trappings of centralized power: scribes, record-keepers, heralds. Hun rule had become institutionalized. Attila understood Rome not as a mirror, but as a quarry. He watched its politics with predatory precision. In the early 440s, the Eastern Roman Empire, exhausted by war and economic strain, once again failed to meet the tribute agreed upon. Attila's response was swift. In 447, he launched a devastating campaign into the Balkans. Cities fell like wheat before the scythe. Serdica, Philippopolis, Archodiopolis, all were ravaged. The Roman army, led by the general Arnagisclus, met the Huns on the Utus River. The battle was fierce, and the Romans fought well, but the result was clear. Attila's forces stood victorious, and the road to Constantinople lay open. The Eastern court panicked. Theodosius too scrambled for peace. The new treaty raised the annual tribute to £2,100 of gold, threefold what it had been under Ruga. Attila had not merely defeated Rome on the field, he had bent it to his will without breaching its walls. He now turned his gaze westward. The Western Roman Empire, crumbling under its own decay, was led by the boy Emperor Valentinian III and the general Aetius, once a friend to the Huns. In his youth, Aetius had lived among them as a hostage, and rose to power partly by calling on Hun aid. But time had changed alliances. In 450, a new provocation arrived, a letter, perhaps forged, from Valentinian's sister, Honoria. In it, she begged Attila to rescue her from a forced marriage and offered her hand and half the empire. Attila accepted the offer. Whether sincere or used as pretext, he now had a claim to a Roman princess and, by his reckoning, to the Western Empire itself. He demanded Honoria's hand and her dowry, territory in Gaul. The Western court refused. In 451, Attila crossed the Rhine with an army that may have numbered in the tens of thousands. Not just Huns, but a multi-ethnic horde, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Alans, and Syri. They swept through Gaul like a plague. Metz fell. Reims fell. Paris awaited doom. But fate would offer resistance. In the fields of northern Gaul, the Huns would meet a coalition unlike any they had yet faced. Romans, Visigoths, and others, united by desperation, prepared to confront the storm. It was in the summer of 451 CE that the fate of Western Europe trembled on the edge of a blade. Attila, wielding the pretext of a royal engagement and the force of his ambition, had crossed into Gaul with his assembled hosts. Behind him stretched a trail of burned cities and emptied towns. His goal was not simply conquest, it was submission. The Roman West, fractured and weak, now faced a test it had long feared. The stage for the confrontation was the Catalonian plains, a vast open ground near present-day Chalons-en-Champagne in northeastern France. Here, Attila's advance was checked not by fortifications, but by resolve. For the first time in his campaigns, the peoples of the West had gathered in unity. Flavius Aetius, the Roman general once known as the last of the Romans, had forged a coalition of Visigoths under King Theodoric I, Burgundians, Franks, and his own Roman troops. The battle that followed has echoed through the centuries. Jordanes, the 6th century Gothic historian, called it one of the bloodiest ever fought. The plains became a place of legend, shrouded in numbers we cannot verify, in heroism we cannot fully trace. But the scale and consequence are undeniable. The armies met in a whirlwind of cavalry charges, arrow storms, and close combat. The Huns struck first, their horse archers unleashing deadly volleys as they rode in wheeling formations. Roman and Gothic infantry held their ground. The Visigoths formed the bulwark of the western line, and their king, Theodoric, led from the front. In the chaos of battle, Theodoric fell, whether trampled by horses or struck down by enemy blades is unknown. Yet his death did not break the Visigoths. Spurred by vengeance and honor, they rallied under his son Thorismund and pushed back with fury. The center of Attila's line began to buckle. Attila himself, ever cautious despite his ferocity, had placed his own tent at the rear, behind a wooden palisade, an unusual measure for a man of such confidence. As his coalition began to falter, he prepared for the worst. But Aetius, though victorious, did not press the advantage. He allowed the Huns to withdraw. Some say he feared that destroying Attila would make the Visigoths too powerful. Others believe he simply lacked the strength for pursuit. The Huns retreated beyond the Rhine, blooded but unbroken. Attila had tasted his first true setback, not a defeat in the field, but a failure of will, of circumstance. The prize had slipped from his grasp. And yet, the West had not destroyed him. In the following year, he would return, not to Gaul, but to Italy itself. In 452 CE, Attila crossed the Alps and descended into the Po Valley. City after city fell without resistance. Aquileia, a jewel of the northern frontier, was besieged and destroyed so utterly that, in later legend, not even its ruins remained. Panic gripped the empire. Refugees poured south toward Ravenna and Rome. The court braced for annihilation. And then came a moment that entered the realm of myth, the meeting between Attila and Pope Leo I. Accounts differ, some say it was the Pope's sanctity, others say it was illness, supply shortages, or diplomacy. But the outcome was the same. Attila turned back. He withdrew his army from Italy and returned north, leaving Rome untouched. Perhaps he had achieved what he desired, a demonstration of power, a reminder that no wall or city stood beyond his reach. Or perhaps he had seen, in that moment, the limit of what force alone could yield. It would be his final campaign. In the spring of 453 CE, the world changed not with fire or conquest, but with silence. Attila, feared by emperors, whispered about by bishops, and obeyed by tribes from the Volga to the Rhine, was found dead in his tent after a night of celebration. It was his wedding feast. He had taken a new bride, a young woman named Ildiko, likely of noble Germanic lineage. The next morning, he did not emerge. The accounts of his death are wrapped in legend. Some say he died of a massive hemorrhage, choking on his own blood from a burst blood vessel while in drunken slumber. Others hinted at betrayal, that Ildiko had slain him in his bed, a kind of Judith to this new Holofernes. Yet no mark of violence was recorded. Priscus, the most reliable source, who had met Attila during his lifetime, leans toward a natural cause, sudden, shocking, unheroic. And so it ended. The man who had brought two Roman empires to their knees, who had crossed rivers and mountains at the head of vast hosts, died not in battle, but in sleep. There was no sword in hand, no final cry of rage, only stillness. The mourning that followed was unprecedented among the Huns. According to tradition, Attila's body was placed in a triple coffin, iron, silver, and gold, each symbolizing a part of his rule, strength, wealth, and majesty. His burial site was hidden by ritual. Slaves who dug the grave were slain, to ensure no one would disturb his rest. The location has never been found. Somewhere beneath the plains of Hungary or the rivers of Pannonia, the bones of the scourge of God lie undisturbed. But death did not end the story, it only began the unraveling. Attila had ruled not only through charisma, but through dominance. He had bound together a coalition of warriors, tribes, and lords through fear, gold, and the promise of plunder. With him gone, the bonds of empire loosened. His sons, among them Elak, Dengizic, and Ernak, sought to divide the inheritance. But there could be no equal successor. The Huns had followed a man, not a crown. Conflict broke out almost immediately. Elak, the eldest, took control of the heartland, but faced resistance from both within and without. Former subject peoples, the Gepids, Ostrogoths, Heruli, seized their chance. In 454, just a year after Attila's death, these groups united under the Gepid king Ardaric and rose against Hun domination. At the Battle of Nedao, the tides turned. The Huns, for the first time, were on the defensive. The battle was savage, its outcome decisive. Elak fell in the fighting, and the Hun host shattered. Survivors fled eastward, some back into the steppes from which they had come, others assimilated into the Germanic tribes they had once ruled. The empire Attila had built, with speed and steel, with fear and fire, dissolved. And yet, the shadow of the Huns remained. In the coming centuries, their name would echo in the steppe, in the arrival of the Avars, in the memory of the Bulgars, in the tactics of the Magyars. In Western Europe, Hun became a byword for the foreign, the feral, the unrelenting. The scourge of God had died, but his legacy, shaped in ash, bone, and trembling, endured. The world had witnessed what it meant to be conquered by emotion. And it would not forget. The death of Attila had loosed a force far more destabilizing than his lifetime of raids, the unraveling of everything he had bound together. His rule had been personal, not institutional. It relied on his charisma, his military prowess, and the sheer momentum of fear. Without him, the Hunnic Empire, a loose tapestry of tribes and loyalties, frayed at once. His eldest son, Elak, was named successor, but his authority was never uncontested. Unlike Attila, he had no towering reputation, no victories of his own. The other sons, Dengizic and Ernak, each carved out their own spheres, and rival warlords among the Huns and their subjugated allies eyed the future with growing independence. The unity of the Hun Federation, already tenuous, began to crack. Their former subjects wasted no time. The Germanic tribes that had once marched under Hun banners, the Gepids, Ostrogoths, Rugians, Heruli, now saw their chance to throw off the yoke. In the year 454, at a place remembered as the Plains of Nedao, these groups formed a rare coalition and confronted the Huns directly. The battle was bloody and final. Jordanes, writing a century later, recorded that the bravest nations fought, with the Goths pressing fiercely, the Gepids striking hard, and the Huns, long feared, finally broken. Elac fell in the fighting, and with him, the central authority of the Huns collapsed. Survivors fled into the interior of the steppe or submitted to the victors. From this moment onward, the Huns ceased to be an empire. But fragments remained. Dengisich, seeking to revive Hun strength, launched new campaigns against the Eastern Roman Empire in the 460s. His efforts were brave, even fierce, but ultimately futile. He lacked the force of numbers and the aura that had once made Roman cities tremble. When he was finally defeated and killed in 469, his head was sent to Constantinople as a trophy. A fitting symbol, perhaps, of how the terror that had once besieged empires had been tamed. Yet not all Huns vanished. Ernak, the youngest son, took a different path. He settled peacefully in the lands of the lower Danube, forging a new identity for his people. The remnants of the Hun elite, through assimilation and reorganization, gave rise to new polities. Some merged with local populations and became indistinct over time. Others, particularly those who moved eastward, continued in steppe traditions. Over the following generations, echoes of Hun military style and social structure can be traced in the emergence of the Bulgars and the Avars, peoples who would play their own roles in reshaping Eastern Europe and Byzantium. Some of the languages spoken among them preserved words and titles from the Hun vocabulary. Their burial practices, with horse interments, artificial cranial deformation, and grave goods of steppe design, showed continuity. For the Roman world, the disappearance of Attila's empire did not mean peace. The migrations the Huns had unleashed continued. The Visigoths had already established themselves in Gaul and Spain, the Vandals ruled North Africa. The Ostrogoths, once clients of the Huns, would soon march into Italy under Theodoric and seize the Western throne. The dominoes had already fallen. And in each of these movements, one could see the shadow of Attila, not as a ruler to be imitated, but as a storm that had reshaped the map. He had forced peoples into motion, broken old alliances, and tested the limits of Rome's endurance. His empire had lasted but a few decades. His impact would linger for centuries. In the years that followed the disintegration of the Hunnic Empire, the lands they once ruled lay open, burned, blooded, and ready for reshaping. Their once mighty camps, scattered across the Pannonian plains, now stood silent. Grass grew where tents had stood, and only the bones beneath the soil spoke of what had been. The memory of Attila still haunted Europe, but the reality of the Huns was fading. In the east, Ernak, Attila's youngest son, maintained a semblance of stability. Unlike his brothers, he understood that the age of conquest had passed. He chose accommodation. By aligning with the Eastern Roman Empire and adopting a less aggressive stance, he preserved a core group of Huns along the lower Danube. This group would become known to some sources as the Akatsiri, and later as one of the elements absorbed into the Bulgar Confederation. Thus, the Huns did not vanish completely. Rather, they transformed. Many of their warriors became mercenaries in Roman service. Others joined the Germanic kingdoms rising from the Western Empire's ruins, Goths, Franks, Lombards. Some simply disappeared into the rural populations of Eastern Europe, intermarrying and assimilating. The distinct identity of Hun gradually became diluted, but their influence remained visible in warfare, in diplomacy, in fear. The Huns had reshaped the battlefield. Their mastery of mounted archery, their use of speed over brute force, and their psychological warfare set a template that later nomadic powers, the Avars, Magyars, even the Mongols, would refine. Rome had learned from them, too. The Eastern Empire, now known as Byzantium, adjusted its military doctrines in response to Hun tactics, adopting more flexible, mobile units and placing greater emphasis on cavalry. Culturally, the legacy of the Huns was more elusive. Their lack of written language meant their story would be told by others, often their enemies. Jordans, Priscus, and later chroniclers painted them in shadow and flame, emphasizing their strangeness, their violence, and their supposed inhumanity. They were shaped more like beasts than men, wrote Ammianus. Their faces like hammered iron. These descriptions, steeped in fear and unfamiliarity, served a purpose. They turned the Huns into a metaphor, the other, the barbarian, the chaos beyond the frontier. In Christian imagination, Attila became the scourge of God, not merely a man, but a punishment, a divine reckoning upon a sinful world. He was remembered not for his strategies or his treaties, but for his destruction. And yet, in the folk memories of Central Europe, another image survived. Among the Hungarians, who arrived in the Carpathian Basin centuries later, legends began to connect their ancestry to the Huns. Though linguistically and historically distinct, the Magyars embraced Attila as a symbolic forefather. Medieval Hungarian chronicles claim descent from him, casting him not as a destroyer, but as a founder. This reinterpretation speaks to the complexity of the Hun legacy. To some, they were demons. To others, ancestors. To all, they were unforgettable. The physical remnants of their passage, cauldrons, sabers, arrowheads, and grave sites, now rested quietly in the earth. Archaeologists in the 20th century unearthed them with care, tracing the paths of once roving tribes and reconstructing a world where movement was might. In the ashes of greatness, something remained, the reminder that power, even when it leaves no ruins, can change the world. The Huns had come from the margins, ruled without cities, and vanished without tombstones. And still, we remember. Long before the final charge at the Catalonian plains, long before the walls of Aquileia crumbled under Hun assault, Rome had known the cost of dealing with the horsemen of the East. Yet even in fear, the empire chose negotiation. It was not cowardice, it was calculation. Against a people who could strike faster than messages could travel, diplomacy became a tool of survival. As early as the 420s and 430s, Rome, particularly the Eastern Empire, had entered into treaties with the Huns. These agreements were not crafted as between equals. The Huns demanded, and Rome paid. Tribute was cloaked in the language of gifts, but everyone understood the truth: it was protection money. In 435, the Treaty of Margus formalized one such arrangement. The Romans agreed to pay £700 of gold annually and to refrain from harboring Hun fugitives. The treaty had barely dried when violations occurred. A Roman bishop desecrated Hun graves, a transgression deeply offensive to the steppe people, who honored their dead not only as ancestors but as guardians of their identity. For the Huns, such an act was not merely sacrilege, it was declaration of war. Attila and Bleda responded as only Huns could, with a storm. Their army crossed the Danube and ravaged the Balkans. Cities burned. Viminatium, Naissus, and Singidunum fell in succession. The Eastern Roman military, sluggish and ill-prepared, was powerless to stop them. The invaders moved not in straight lines, but in arcs and circles, encircling fortresses, cutting supply lines, and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. It was war as nightmare, a rhythm Rome could not predict. And yet, after each campaign, Attila returned to the table. He demanded more gold, more concessions, and Rome gave them. In 443, the tribute rose to £2,100 annually. That sum, though staggering, was less than the cost of rebuilding razed cities or mobilizing fractured legions. Gold, for Rome, had become cheaper than blood. But Attila's demands were never just about wealth. Each negotiation was a performance of dominance. Roman envoys were received in Hun courts with deliberate ceremony, seated low, spoken to from above, made to witness the simplicity of the court juxtaposed with the grandeur of its power. Attila drank from wooden cups while his generals used gold. The message was clear: he was master not of treasure, but of men. Priscus of Panium, one of the few Romans to leave a first-hand account of Hun diplomacy, described his visit to Attila's camp in vivid detail. The tents, the feasts, the austere manners of the ruler, all pointed to a culture both alien and deeply ordered. The Huns were not wild raiders, but a people with their own code of respect, justice, and honor. They judged betrayal harshly, but respected oaths. Priscus observed that Roman defectors often found favor among the Huns, provided they proved useful. Rome's reliance on tribute was a double-edged sword. It bought temporary peace, yes, but it also fueled Hun strength. Each coin paid fed horses, forged weapons, bound vassals with gifts. The Huns, already fierce, became more sophisticated. They learned Rome's weaknesses, not only its crumbling armies, but its politics, its divisions, its dependence on treaties over trust. Attila understood this deeply. He maneuvered not just with soldiers, but with knowledge. He manipulated court intrigues, exploited regional rivalries, and always left Rome guessing, would he strike next? Or speak? This dance continued for nearly 2 decades. Rome, the eternal city, mother of law and empire, had become the supplicant. And the Huns, children of the wind and fire, held the leash. While the Eastern Roman Empire reeled under Hun demands and assaults, the Western Empire teetered on the brink. By the mid-5th century, it was not truly an empire in the old sense. It was a fractured domain held together by reputation, fear, and the iron will of a few men. Among them stood Flavius Aetius, the so-called last of the Romans. Aetius was no ordinary general. Born to a Roman mother and a Scythian father, he had spent part of his youth as a hostage among the Huns. There, he learned their language, their customs, and, most importantly, their strengths. He rose through the ranks not by bloodline, but by cunning, forging alliances, crushing rebellions, and manipulating both barbarians and senators. When the Western Empire needed a sword, Aetius provided it. Yet even he could not stem the tide alone. The West was bleeding. Spain had fallen to the Visigoths. North Africa, once the empire's breadbasket, now belonged to the Vandals. Gaul was a mosaic of Roman cities, Frankish villages, and Gothic fiefdoms. The legions were no longer Roman-born, but filled with federates, warriors who fought for pay, not patriotism. Into this cracked edifice came a letter. In 450 CE, Honoria, sister of Emperor Valentinian III, reached out to Attila. Desperate to escape an arranged marriage, she sent him a ring and a plea. What exactly she offered remains debated. Was it a marriage proposal? A cry for help? A trap? Regardless, Attila chose to interpret it as betrothal, and with it, a claim to half the Western Empire as dowry. Valentinian was furious. He declared his sister's letter invalid, confined her, and dismissed the claim. But Attila did not. He now had pretext, imperial bloodline, insult, and opportunity. In the spring of 451, he crossed the Rhine. What followed was not mere war, but incursion on a civilizational scale. Attila's army was not composed of Huns alone. It was a polyglot horde, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Syri, Heruli, and even disaffected Roman allies. He moved like a storm through Gaul, laying waste to cities whose names had stood since Caesar's day. Metz fell. Soissons fell. Reims was spared only by fortune. At Lutetia, the future Paris, a Christian legend emerged. Saint Genevieve, who led the city in prayer, was said to have turned Attila away. In truth, he bypassed it. But the myth, like the man, lingered. His target was Orleans. As the city prepared for siege, Aetius raced north, forging a desperate alliance with the Visigoths under Theodoric I. The Romans and Goths had long been uneasy neighbors, but now survival demanded unity. Their combined army moved to intercept Attila, and the two forces met near Chalons in what became the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. The clash, brutal and bloody, forced Attila to retreat, a rare reversal. But it was not the end. In the following year, Attila invaded Italy. He swept through the Po Valley, razed Aquileia, and advanced on Rome. Panic gripped the empire. The emperor fled to Ravenna. Refugees flooded southward. It seemed the eternal city would fall. Then came the moment of legend. Pope Leo I, unarmed, robed in white, rode out to meet Attila. What passed between them is unknown. Roman sources claim divine intervention. Later stories spoke of angels at Leo's side, warning Attila off. More likely, famine, disease, and pressure from the Eastern Empire convinced Attila to turn back. But what mattered was perception. Rome had been spared, not by armies, but by a bishop. Attila withdrew to his camp, his campaign unfinished, his prize untouched. Yet in that moment, his myth grew even greater. He had stood at the gates of Rome unchallenged. He had turned away, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The year was 452 CE, and Attila, now in the final arc of his reign, had withdrawn from Italy. He had crossed the Alps with confidence, ravaged the fertile plains of the Po Valley, and destroyed cities that had stood for centuries. But with Rome still standing, and the Western Empire still intact, if only in name, his ambition remained unfulfilled. And yet, something had shifted. Attila's forces had suffered. The Italian campaign, unlike his rapid strikes in the Balkans and Gaul, had stretched supply lines and exposed his horde to disease and famine. The land had already been ravaged by earlier Gothic and Vandal incursions. The lush fields that once fed Rome's legions now offered little for the tens of thousands in Attila's army. The very ferocity of the invasion had scorched the earth behind it. Moreover, pressure from the east had resumed. The Eastern Roman Empire, no longer under the immediate threat of invasion, had begun to reinforce the Danube frontier. Attila could not risk a two-front war, not with internal dissent simmering among his subject peoples. The cohesion of his empire was strong but not indestructible. Loyalty among his allies was measured in plunder. Without victory, the bonds frayed. Thus, Attila returned to his court, likely near the Tisa River, and began preparations for a new campaign. This time, it would be against the Eastern Romans once more. He intended to extract a final price from Constantinople, a definitive statement that his reign had not ended in withdrawal but in renewed conquest. But destiny would intervene. In early 453, as preparations continued, Attila took a new wife, Ildico, a young woman of noble lineage, perhaps Gothic or Frankish. Their marriage was not just personal, it was political, a symbol of alliance or submission, a final act of consolidation. On the night of the feast, Attila drank deeply, as was custom. That night, as the court slept and the fires dimmed, Attila bled, silently, fatally. He was found in the morning, lifeless in his bed, with no wound upon him. Some claimed he had ruptured a blood vessel, bleeding from the nose and mouth, drowning in his own body. Others whispered of poison or assassination. The chronicler Priscus, who had once looked into his eyes and recorded his words, offered no final judgment, only that the scourge of God had died without a sword drawn. His death was not majestic, but his funeral was. According to tradition, his body was enclosed in 3 coffins, iron, silver, and gold. A river was diverted to conceal the burial site, then returned to its course. The slaves who dug the grave were killed, so none would reveal its location. The earth closed over Attila, and with it, the breath of an empire. But the silence did not last. Within a year, his sons, Elac, Dengizic, Ernak, had begun to divide his inheritance. Rivalries emerged. The subordinate tribes, sensing weakness, rose up. At the Battle of Nedao in 454, the Gepids and their allies shattered the Hunnic elite. Elac was killed. The empire collapsed. Dengizic tried once more in 469 to rekindle his father's legacy with an invasion of Eastern Roman territory. He failed. Captured and beheaded, his skull, like a grim crown, was sent to Constantinople. Only Ernak survived with a legacy intact. he led the remnants of the Huns to the lower Danube and established a modest domain. Some of his people would merge with other steppe tribes and reappear in history as Bulgars. Others faded from the record. And so the last campaigns of Attila ended not with conquest, but with dispersion. He had reshaped the world. But the world moved on. After the funeral fires faded and the dirt settled over Attila's grave, the empire he had ruled began to unravel with terrifying speed. His sons, Elak, Dengizic, and Ernak, inherited not a kingdom, but a burden. What their father had united through fear, cunning, and charisma, they were now expected to govern through inheritance. But inheritance alone was not enough. Elak, the eldest and presumed heir, took command of the core Hun territories in the Carpathian Basin. He possessed warriors, wealth, and a sense of destiny, but lacked Attila's authority. His brothers, ambitious and impatient, refused subordination. Dengizic, bold and hot-tempered, ruled in the east. Ernak, cautious and shrewd, remained in the background, watching, waiting. Meanwhile, the very peoples the Huns had once subjugated, the Gepids, Ostrogoths, Heruli, Rugians, stirred. For years, they had marched under Hun banners, fought in Attila's wars, and shared in his plunder. But they had done so as subjects, not partners. Now, with the central Hun authority weakened, they saw an opportunity to reclaim their freedom. Ardaric, king of the Gepids and once one of Attila's most trusted allies, raised the banner of rebellion. He gathered a coalition of tribes and marched to confront Elak. The two forces met at the river Nedao in 454 CE, a place now lost to time, but remembered for the blood spilled upon its banks. The battle was vast, chaotic, and final. Former allies now fought one another with ferocity born of long-held resentment. The Huns, once the terror of two empires, were overwhelmed. Elak fell, his body trampled beneath the very horsemen who once hailed him as prince. This was no ordinary defeat. It was the collapse of a system. The Hun imperial structure, which had bound dozens of tribes in a web of fear and gold, disintegrated almost overnight. Chieftains deserted. Subjects declared independence. Encampments emptied. Power, once centralized, now splintered across the map. Dengizic, refusing to yield, fled eastward and regrouped. For years, he attempted to maintain Hun identity and military relevance. In 469, he launched a final assault against the Eastern Roman Empire, hoping to regain prestige and territory. But the times had changed. His forces were repelled, his army broken. He was captured, and his head, like a grim offering, was sent to Constantinople. It was displayed on the walls, not just as a trophy, but as a warning: the Huns no longer ruled. Of the three brothers, only Ernak survived with dignity. He did not resist the tide of history, but rode its current. He settled with his people along the lower Danube, in alliance with the Eastern Romans. Some of his followers integrated into the local populations. Others merged with steppe tribes, forming part of the ethnogenesis of the Bulgars, who would later rise as a formidable force in the Balkans. Thus, the empire of Attila, forged in fire and fear, came to an end. But its legacy lived on. in the memories of devastated cities, in the tactics of future nomads, in the fear etched into the maps of old chroniclers. The sons of the wolf, as the Huns sometimes styled themselves, had ruled for a moment in history's great arc. A moment of thunder, of motion, of power without permanence. And then, like a storm that passes, they were gone. When the dust of Nedao had settled and the camps of the Huns lay broken, the plains of Pannonia grew quiet. But history does not end with silence. In the great movements of peoples, in the long shadows cast by vanished empires, echoes linger. The name of the Huns did not vanish from memory, it transformed. In the east, where the rivers of the lower Danube met the Black Sea, remnants of the Hunnic people regrouped. Here, under Ernaka's leadership, the Huns did not resist change, they became part of it. They aligned themselves with Rome, accepted titles, intermarried with local elites, and gradually merged into a new cultural fabric. These Huns retained their language and traditions for some time, but each generation blurred the line further. From these groups, perhaps, came the Arnagas, a name that, in later Byzantine sources, was often used interchangeably with Huns. Whether they were direct descendants or merely cultural successors, they carried elements of Hunnic identity into the 6th and 7th centuries. Their name would leave a lasting trace. The very word Hungaria derives from Vloniga, through the legacy of later steppe peoples who settled in the Carpathian Basin. To the north and east, other Hun survivors continued their lives as nomads. Some may have returned to the Pontic Caspian steppe, joining with Turkic and Iranian groups. Archaeological finds suggest continuity in burial practices, elongated skulls, horse sacrifices, cauldrons cast in bronze, all hallmarks of Hun tradition. The Avars, who appeared in Europe in the late 6th century, claimed descent from the Huns. Though modern scholars debate this, their political structure and military tactics bore striking similarities. They ruled from the same plains, raided the same borders, and struck similar fear into the hearts of the Byzantines. Whether they were true Huns or heirs in name alone, they consciously adopted the image. The same can be said of the Bulgars. Formed from a mixture of Turkic, Iranian, and possibly Hun elements, they emerged from the steppe in the 7th century and carved out a lasting kingdom in the Balkans. Some of their ruling clans bore names and titles reminiscent of earlier Hun aristocracy. The connection was not simply genetic, it was ideological. To call oneself a Hun was to invoke power. Meanwhile, in the West, the image of the Huns lived on in Christian imagination. Medieval chroniclers, centuries after Attila's death, continued to speak of him as the scourge of God, a divine punishment for Rome's decadence and sin. In epic poems and folk tales, he became a symbol, a dark rider from the east, summoned by fate, relentless and inevitable. But in the lands he had once ruled, another memory took root. When the Magyars arrived in the Carpathian Basin in the late 9th century, they too found a land still whispering of the Huns. The ruins they passed, the battlefields they crossed, the echoes in the soil, all spoke of a people who had once ruled with fire and hoofbeat. In time, the Magyars would embrace that legacy. They named Attila as their forefather, Ernak as their ancestor. It did not matter that the bloodline was distant, or even mythic. What mattered was the story. The Huns had become not just a people, but a symbol of swiftness, strength, and sovereignty. Their empire had been short-lived, but their shadow was long. Long after their disappearance as a political force, the Huns remained alive in the minds of those who had once feared them. Their name, Hun, took on a mythic resonance, a shorthand for savagery and apocalypse, for the enemy from the east who burned cities and broke empires. In truth, much of what posterity remembered was shaped less by who the Huns were, and more by what they represented. For the Roman world, especially in the West, Attila became the embodiment of wrath. Christian writers framed his invasion not merely as the ambition of a warlord, but as divine retribution. Prosper of Aquitaine, Hydacius, and other chroniclers wrote of Attila as the flagellum Dei, the scourge of God. In their telling, he had been sent to chastise a corrupt and sinful civilization, to punish Rome for its pride. This framing served more than theological purposes. It excused Rome's failures, its defeats, its tribute payments, its retreat behind walls. If Attila was a tool of heaven, then resistance was less important than repentance. In churches across the collapsing empire, sermons warned of a world grown too decadent to stand. At the same time, the Huns became figures of fascination. Priscus, who had walked among them, painted a more nuanced portrait, one that future generations would struggle to reconcile with the monstrous legends. He described Attila as modest in dress, stern in judgment, and surrounded by a court that was, in its own way, ordered and disciplined. The man behind the myth was neither barbarian brute nor divine scourge, but a leader shaped by the world he commanded. Later historians, such as Jordan's, would blend fact and fable. Writing in the 6th century, Jordan's crafted a vision of Gothic history in which the Huns were both a menace and a mirror. They were the opposite of Gothic virtue, wild where the Goths were noble, cruel where the Goths were just. Yet even he could not deny the scale of what they had accomplished. Among the Germanic peoples, stories of the Huns entered oral tradition. In the Nibelungenlied, the medieval German epic, Attila appears under the name Etzel, not as a destroyer, but as a royal figure, feared and respected. In Norse sagas and Hungarian folklore, similar transformations occurred. The man who had brought terror became part of the heroic age. But in Eastern Europe, closer to the soil where the Huns had camped, their legacy was more practical. The styles of Hun warfare, light cavalry, mounted archery, sudden raids, would influence tactics for centuries. The Byzantines adapted their defenses to counter nomadic threats, while later steppe peoples, from Avars to Pechenegs, followed the same patterns. Even after 1,000 years, the echo of the Hun remained. In the 19th and 20th centuries, European historians returned to the Huns with new questions. Were they ancestors of modern Hungarians? Were they truly barbarians, or simply outsiders misunderstood by Roman chroniclers? Archaeologists unearthed Hun burial sites, grave goods, weapons, skeletal remains, and began to reconstruct a culture that had long been buried under fear and fiction. What emerged was a clearer picture. The Huns were not mindless destroyers, but complex actors in a time of immense upheaval. They were both cause and consequence of Rome's fall, symptom and signal of a world transforming. Their empire was brief, but catalytic, a fire that reshaped the forest, even if it burned for only a moment. And so, the memory of the Huns endures, not as they were feared, but as they truly were, a people of the horse and bow, of wide skies and fierce loyalty, who rose from the steppes and, for a heartbeat in time, held the fate of empires in their grasp. While the West preserved the Huns in legend and fear, the steppes of Central Eurasia, the birthplace of their culture, preserved something deeper, the continuity of their world. There, in the wide grasslands between the Volga and the Altai, the rhythms of nomadic life continued almost unchanged. The Huns had vanished as a political name, but the systems they relied on, the horse pastoralism, the clan loyalties, the swift warfare, remained. The Huns were not the first great steppe confederation, and they would not be the last. Before them came the Xiongnu, feared enemies of the Chinese empires, whose fragmented remnants may have drifted west and merged into the Hun identity. After them would rise the Gokturks, the Khazars, the Pechenegs, and ultimately the Mongols, each drawing on the legacy of mobile power built on mobility, archery, and the deep understanding of the land. Among these peoples, stories were passed not in scrolls but in song, through the recitations of bards, the chants of shamans, the genealogies spoken beside campfires. And in those songs, the Huns often appeared not as destroyers, but as ancestors. A mighty generation who had once held sway from the Black Sea to the gates of Rome. Their memory, stripped of Christian moralizing, was one of triumph, fierce, nomadic, and proud. Archaeological work in the Eurasian steppe has revealed a material culture rich and diverse: metal cauldrons, ornate belt buckles, horn bows, and ceremonial horse gear, buried with their owners beneath mounds that dotted the landscape. These kurgans, often overlooked by ancient chroniclers, spoke a different story, of skilled craftsmanship, of deep ritual, of an identity bound to the horse and the open sky. Skull modification, a cultural practice among the Huns and related peoples, left a striking legacy in burial remains. Elongated crania, shaped in infancy, marked elite status and ethnic identity. The practice was both a visual marker and a statement of belonging. Such features are found from the Volga to the Danube, evidence of how far the Huns had spread their influence. Even in Chinese records, distant echoes can be found. The histories of the Northern Wei and other dynasties recall nomadic pressures along their borders, patterns similar to those that Rome experienced. In these distant mirrors, we see the Huns not as isolated, but as part of a larger pattern of steppe empires rising and falling in rhythm with the settled world. This pattern of rise, collision, transformation, shaped the Eurasian continent for millennia. The Huns, though only one chapter, were pivotal. They linked the East and West not through trade, as the Silk Road had done, but through movement, through pressure, through the creation of vast spaces of uncertainty that forced empires to adapt. And perhaps that is their true legacy on the steppe, the creation of the frontier as a permanent zone of negotiation. The Romans, the Byzantines, the Persians, the Chinese, all learned that the border was not a wall, but a shifting space. A place of raids and gifts, of marriages and betrayals, of tribute and war. The steppes remembered the Huns not as the end, but as a beginning. A sign that from the wind and grass, power could rise. And from silence, stories could endure. To understand the Huns beyond their campaigns and conquests, one must look within, to the inner workings of their society, to the fabric of their world, not forged in steel, but in structure. They were not merely raiders, as Roman accounts would often portray, but a people bound by customs, hierarchies, and a way of life that had endured through generations of steppe migration. At the heart of Hun society was mobility. Their entire existence was structured around movement. They did not build cities or castles. Instead, their wealth and power were carried with them, in flocks, in horses, in wagons that formed mobile encampments wherever they paused. These were not haphazard tents, but organized clusters arranged by clan and status, centered around the tent of the ruling chief or king. Attila, for instance, presided over his people not from a palace of stone, but from a large wooden hall built in the middle of his camp. It was not permanent, but it was regal. Priscus, the Roman diplomat who visited Attila's court, described with all the structure's size and the scale of the ceremonies held within. The Huns may have rejected Roman opulence, but they understood pageantry, and they practiced their own version with precision. Social hierarchy among the Huns was steep. At the top stood the king, often supported by his immediate family and a circle of elite nobles, the warrior aristocracy. Beneath them were the common freemen, warriors, herdsmen, archers. And at the lowest rung, there were captives and slaves, men and women taken during raids, often used in labor, craftsmanship, or as concubines. Some were even adopted into clans, blurring the lines between servitude and assimilation. Loyalty was crucial. A chief's power depended not on his bloodline alone, but on the warriors who followed him. These men swore personal allegiance and received gifts, horses, weapons, plunder, in return for their service. The king who could give the most retained the most followers. In this sense, wealth was not hoarded, but distributed. Generosity was power. This structure extended to their military. The Huns did not rely on massive infantry formations like the Romans. Their strength lay in mounted warfare, in mobility, in feigned retreats, in enveloping movements. Hun horsemen carried composite bows, weapons of astonishing range and accuracy, and could shoot while riding at full gallop. Their arrows, loosed in dense volleys, broke enemy morale before blades ever met. Discipline came from experience, not manuals. Young men learned to ride before they could walk. Boys were trained in archery, taught to endure hardship, to sleep in the open, to move without trace. Warfare was not a disruption of life, it was its continuation. Religiously, the Huns are elusive. They left no temples, no written liturgy. But there are traces of animistic and shamanistic beliefs, reverence for nature, for the sky, for ancestral spirits. Some accounts mention diviners and seers, especially among women, who interpreted omens and guided ritual. They buried their dead with care, weapons, tools, food, all for use in the afterlife. Even artificial cranial deformation, binding infants' heads to create elongated skulls, had spiritual and social meaning. It marked nobility, set the Huns apart from their neighbors, and perhaps linked them to the sky gods they revered. It was a way to wear identity on the body itself. Through all this, one sees a people deeply adapted to their world, not primitive, not lost, but shaped by an environment that demanded resilience, speed, and cohesion. The Huns did not need Rome's architecture to build an empire. Their foundation was older, and, for a time, just as strong. They were not dust blown from the steppe. They were the wind itself. In the geopolitical chessboard of the 5th century, the Huns turned roads into veins, not for trade, but for tribute. Gold flowed not through markets, but along fear-shaped routes from Constantinople and Ravenna to the plains of Pannonia. The Huns, unlike empires built on taxes and bureaucrats, ruled through pressure. And the roads they controlled pulsed with anxiety, not commerce. The tribute Rome paid was staggering. Under successive treaties, first negotiated by Ruger, then expanded by Attila and Bleda, the Eastern Roman Empire agreed to annual payments that grew from £350 of gold to 700, then to 2,100, a massive drain on imperial coffers. These sums were not extracted through peace, they were bought through the memory of past destruction and the threat of its return. Yet the Huns did not just demand tribute. They expected dignity. Envoys sent to Attila were often received in elaborate ceremonies designed to affirm the hierarchy, the Huns on high ground, the Romans seated below, gifts exchanged, but on unequal terms. When Priscus visited Attila's camp, he described the rituals not with disdain, but with an uncomfortable recognition. The Romans, he realized, were no longer the dominant partner. This inversion of roles was at the heart of Hun strategy. They knew they could not hold Roman cities or administer provinces. But they could make the empire dance. By raiding, retreating, and returning, the Huns created a rhythm of instability that forced Rome to react. Rome could not plan ahead, it could only respond. This gave the Huns leverage far beyond their numbers. The tribute also served internal purposes. Attila distributed gold to his nobles, warriors, and foreign allies. This generosity reinforced his supremacy. In the steppe world, a ruler's greatness was measured not by what he hoarded, but by what he gave. A chieftain who could not reward his followers lost them. Thus, Roman gold became the lifeblood of Hun political cohesion. Beyond the imperial centers, smaller cities and tribal leaders also paid the Huns. In exchange, they received promises of non-aggression or Hun support in local disputes. The Huns became kingmakers in the borderlands. They supported Roman claimants against rivals. They offered military aid to barbarian kings, and retracted it when it no longer served them. This network of tribute and allegiance stretched across the continent. From the Roman Danube provinces to the steppe chiefdoms of the Volga, the Huns operated like the eye of a storm, central, mobile, feared, and courted. They understood better than most that power was not only held through conquest, but through presence. To be feared was to be felt. Their movement shaped migration itself. Germanic tribes displaced by Hun expansion pressed into Roman territory. This was not a side effect, it was often deliberate. The Huns forced other peoples westward, creating pressure on Roman borders and increasing their own value as potential allies or threats. This chain reaction, which began with the Huns' arrival in Eastern Europe, culminated in the migrations that transformed the Western Roman Empire. Attila's court became the hub where such decisions were made. One might find ambassadors from both Roman empires, Gothic envoys, Slavic chieftains, and Turkic tribes, all waiting for a word, a gesture, a frown. His command, like the bow he carried, could release consequences across continents. In this way, the Huns redefined diplomacy. They did not build roads. They bent them. And along those paths of tribute, the world changed its course. For most of Roman history, cities were sanctuaries, walled enclosures of law, religion, and continuity. When barbarians raided the countryside, it was to these fortified towns that people fled. But the Huns challenged that confidence. Their assaults were not random strikes, they were tests of Rome's urban heart. And increasingly, those hearts failed. Attila's sieges were swift, brutal, and often effective. He did not waste time with the formalities of Roman siegecraft. Where Roman generals might dig trenches, build siege towers, and plan long campaigns, the Huns attacked with speed and overwhelming terror. Their weapon was fear itself, and it breached many a wall before a ram touched stone. Among the cities that felt the weight of Hun aggression, few suffered like Naissus, the birthplace of Constantine the Great. Once a jewel of the Balkans, it lay in ruin after Attila's army swept through. Singidunum, modern Belgrade, Margus, and Viminatium followed, stripped of their wealth, their churches desecrated, their defenders slaughtered. The messages sent back to Constantinople were not pleas, they were warnings. In 447, during Attila's most devastating campaign in the east, he reached Thermopylae, the ancient gate to Greece itself. Though he did not pass it, the implication was clear: nowhere was safe. Cities that had stood for centuries could fall in a day. Even Constantinople, mighty behind its Theodosian walls, trembled. Refugees crowded into its ports, and the empire paid yet more gold to forestall the fire. In the west, the story repeated. Metz, Trier, and other Gallo-Roman towns fell under Hun assault. Some tried to buy peace, others fought and were crushed. Aquileia, the great city at the head of the Adriatic, suffered the worst fate. In 452, Attila laid siege to it, and when it fell, he ordered its total destruction. So complete was the devastation that later generations claimed they could not even find its ruins. The psychological impact of such events cannot be overstated. Rome had faced sieges before, by Hannibal, by Germanic tribes, but the Huns represented something different. They were not merely enemies, they were a force of nature, an unpredictable tempest that defied containment. The sense that civilization could fall overnight changed the way people thought about power and security. Churches and monasteries took on new roles. With city walls no longer trusted, many turned to saints and relics. Hagiographies from this era are filled with stories of divine intervention, a holy figure who turned Attila's army away, a relic that made the ground tremble, visions of angels and portents. Whether true or not, these stories filled the space that crumbling defenses could no longer hold. Pope Leo's encounter with Attila near Mantua became the most famous such moment. Though Attila withdrew for reasons likely tied to famine, disease, and Eastern pressure, Christian writers saw divine judgment. It became a foundational myth for papal authority, that even the scourge of God bent to the shepherd of Rome. But not all cities were so fortunate. Many simply disappeared from history, their names surviving only in church lists and ruined stones. For centuries after, pilgrims would pass by mounds and fragments, speaking in hushed tones of the time when the Huns came and the land burned. Urban life did recover, slowly and unevenly. But it had changed. Cities fortified more heavily, retreated from open plains, shrank in population. The ideal of the Roman civitas, orderly, prosperous, secure, faded. In its place grew a medieval landscape, one of fortresses, monasteries, and villages clustered around lords. The age of classical cities had met its match, and the Huns had struck the blow. Amid the thunder of hooves and the clamor of conquest, the voices of women in Hun society often go unheard. Yet they were there not merely as companions or captives, but as participants in the life, diplomacy, and continuity of the steppe world. Though rarely named in the chronicles, their influence can be traced in the margins of history, in the customs passed down, and in the fears and fascinations of their Roman observers. The roles of Hun women were shaped, like all things, by the demands of mobility. In a society that moved with the seasons and lived from the land and the herd, women were central to survival. They managed the daily rhythms of nomadic life, tending livestock, preparing food, maintaining yurts or tents, and overseeing the upbringing of children. In a world without permanent settlements, their labor was not domestic in the Roman sense, it was foundational. But women were not confined to work alone. They held social and ritual significance. In many steppe cultures, including the Huns, women could act as seers or shamans. Some chroniclers hinted that important decisions were made after consultations with women believed to possess spiritual insight. Such figures were both feared and respected, intermediaries between the human and divine. One such woman, though never named, appears in the account of Priscus. She was a seer, elderly and revered, consulted during a period of unrest. Though her prophecy is not recorded, the respect shown to her, and the attention her words received, speaks volumes. Among the Huns, age and spiritual authority could grant women a voice that transcended social rank. Marriage was a key instrument of diplomacy and alliance. Just as Roman emperors arranged marriages for political gain, so too did Hun leaders. Attila himself had many wives, not just for pleasure, but to secure the loyalty of powerful clans and client tribes. These women, though rarely mentioned, were conduits of unity. Through them, the bonds of the confederation were maintained. The case of Ildiko, Attila's final bride, stands apart. She was young, reportedly of Germanic descent, and married to Attila shortly before his sudden death. Roman chroniclers, always eager for drama, suggested she may have played a role in his demise, perhaps poisoning him, or stabbing him in his sleep. These claims are unlikely, but their persistence reflects a deeper truth, the fear of a powerful woman within the tent of a powerful man. Captive women also played a complex role. Some were taken as spoils of war, others as hostages to ensure compliance from conquered peoples. Yet even among captives, fates varied. Some became concubines, others wives, and still others were absorbed into the broader community. In a society where ethnicity was fluid and lineage could be reshaped by loyalty, even captives could rise, if they adapted. The children of these unions, between Huns and Goths, Huns and Romans, embodied the fusion of worlds. Many served in Hun retinues, others became diplomats or intermediaries. Women, by bearing and raising them, became the quiet architects of this hybrid world. It is through them that the legacy of the Huns was transmitted, not in books, but in flesh and blood. Even the practice of artificial cranial deformation, binding the heads of infants to elongate the skull, was a maternal act. It was mothers who shaped the bodies of their children in accordance with elite customs. In doing so, they marked them not only physically, but socially, as inheritors of status and tradition. So while the Huns rode with bows and war cries, it was the women who anchored them. They did not build walls or monuments, but their presence was no less enduring. They stitched the fabric of a moving world. And though their names are lost, their hands shaped an empire. One of the great mysteries that surround the Huns lies in their speech, the language they used to command, to negotiate, to name their gods and their enemies. They left behind no written records of their own, no inscriptions, no literature. And so, their tongue, the sounds that echoed across plains, in war councils, in marriage negotiations and peace treaties, has vanished. What language did the Huns speak? Scholars have long debated this. The most widely accepted theory today is that the core Hunnic language was of Turkic origin, possibly related to the Ugaric branch, the ancestor of the language once spoken by the Bulgars and Khazars. Words attributed to the Huns in Roman and Greek sources, like meadows, mead, or titles like Kargan, Khan, seem to point in this direction. However, the Huns were not a monolithic people. They were a confederation, a coalition of steppe nomads, Germanic vassals, Iranian tribes, and other groups pressed into their orbit. This created a multilingual environment where command and diplomacy required fluency in many tongues. Attila likely spoke several languages, including Gothic, Latin, and perhaps a form of Greek, or at least used translators well versed in them. Priscus, who met Attila during a diplomatic mission, describes a diverse court where multiple interpreters were present. This suggests that communication was carefully managed, with language used not only to bridge gaps but to assert control. A ruler who needed interpreters could still dominate, provided he controlled the message, and Attila always did. Titles and ranks in Hun society further hint at linguistic layering. The word Attilath itself, likely a Gothic or Turkic Gothic hybrid, means little father or father of the people. Such a name, respectful and intimate, could have been crafted by his Gothic allies or subjects, a gesture of loyalty or submission. It also reflects how the Huns adopted terms from those they ruled, shaping them into tools of authority. Other titles like Khan, Tarkan, or Beg, while more common in later steppe empires, may have had early equivalents among the Huns. These words denoted rank, office, and tribal function. Even without their exact vocabulary, we know the Huns had a clear hierarchy, which implies a structured means of recognition and command. Religious terminology is harder to trace. The Hun spiritual life was oral and animistic, likely involving sky worship, ancestor veneration, and shamanistic rituals. Words for spirit, sky, or horse, central to steppe cosmology, may have echoed across generations, preserved in chants, blessings, or taboos. But these have left no trace on stone or parchment. Still, language leaves echoes. Some Hun words may have been passed down through the Bulgars or preserved in Old Turkic inscriptions centuries later. In place names and personal names, fragments survive. The title Attila remained in use in Hungary and beyond, long after his death. And in medieval Hungarian chronicles, Hun names appear, sometimes distorted, sometimes mythologized, but never forgotten. The Huns' linguistic disappearance tells its own story of a people who moved too fast for parchment, whose empire existed not in writing but in motion. Where Rome carved its laws into marble, the Huns carved their rule into the memory of those they encountered. Their speech, now silent, once shaped the course of nations. And in that silence, power still echoes. To the early Christian world, the coming of the Huns was not merely a geopolitical event, it was an eschatological one. They were not simply invaders. They were signs, portents, proof that the world was unwell, perhaps nearing its end. In the cracked walls of cities, in the smoking fields, in the terror of unannounced arrivals, the early church saw more than history unfolding, it saw judgment. The figure of Attila loomed especially large in this theology. Chroniclers did not content themselves with military explanations. Instead, they reached for divine ones. Attila became the flagellum Dei, the scourge of God, a title that did not emerge from the Huns themselves, but from those who survived them. In this view, he was not merely a man, but an instrument, punishment for Roman decadence, for imperial pride, for spiritual decay. Such a framing served many purposes. It gave suffering meaning. It reinforced the moral authority of the Church. And it reoriented Roman identity away from military grandeur toward spiritual endurance. Rome had once been invincible, now it was vulnerable. But in vulnerability came the Christian ideal of humility, penitence, and divine reliance. Bishops became defenders, not just of doctrine, but of cities. When emperors fled, bishops remained. When Attila approached the gates of Rome, it was not an army that went to meet him, but Pope Leo I. Whether by negotiation or providence, Attila turned away. The event, though likely influenced by plague and logistical concerns, was transformed into sacred narrative, the power of faith against the sword. Sermons from the time speak in apocalyptic tones. The end of days was a common fear. The invasions were seen as fulfillment of prophecy. From Augustine's City of God to the writings of Sidonius Apollinaris, there is a thread of deep unease, not only at Rome's fall, but at the world's unraveling. Even the descriptions of the Huns reflect this. Roman and Christian authors portrayed them as inhuman, monstrous, barely distinguishable from demons. Their faces were flat, their speech barking, their bodies shaped by cruelty. Such dehumanization was not only born of fear, but of theology. The Huns were cast as agents of the devil, a necessary darkness through which the light of faith could shine more brightly. Yet even within these texts, glimpses of complexity emerge. Priscus, again the exception, records moments of peace, of reason, of hospitality. He does not paint Attila as a beast, but as a man, shrewd, reserved, commanding. This tension, between lived experience and theological framing, marks much of the Christian writing about the Huns. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the Church rose in its place. And the Huns, by battering the imperial edifice, unintentionally cleared the stage. The bishops who had stood firm became leaders in a new sense, moral anchors in a drifting world. Their stories of resistance, survival, and divine intervention helped shape the medieval church's self-image for centuries. Thus, Attila, conqueror of cities, destroyer of armies, also became a character in a far greater drama. In cathedrals and chapels, his name was spoken not only with fear, but with awe. He was both enemy and evidence, proof that the world needed salvation. In the Christian imagination, he remained, not in chronicles alone, but in sermons, stained glass, and whispered warnings. A rider from the east. A shadow on the wall. A lesson carved in flame. The Goths and the Huns, though often grouped together in Roman chronicles as barbarians, were fundamentally different in origin, in society, and in their destinies. And yet, their stories are so tightly interwoven that to speak of one is to glimpse the reflection of the other. They were not allies by nature, nor enemies by fate. Rather, they were bound by a history of domination, resistance, and eventual transformation. When the Huns first appeared in the late 4th century, it was the Goths who bore the brunt of their arrival. Living near the northern banks of the Danube, the Tervings and Greuthungs, subgroups of the Gothic people, were among the first to feel the Hun storm. Their flight across the Danube in 376, begging the Eastern Roman Empire for asylum, was a moment that shook the ancient world. It triggered the chain of events that led to the Battle of Adrianople in 378, where a Roman emperor fell, the first in centuries to die in battle against outsiders. This catastrophe was not caused by the Goths alone, but by the pressure the Huns had applied behind them. In a sense, the Huns did not need to fight Rome directly at first, they could break its borders through the movement of others. And the Goths, displaced and desperate, became both victims and catalysts. In the decades that followed, many Goths entered the Hunnic sphere. Some, like the Ostrogoths, were conquered outright. Others, like the Visigoths, maintained independence but bore scars from earlier subjugation. Within the Hunnic Empire, Gothic warriors fought as vassals, Gothic women were taken as wives or captives, and Gothic princes were raised in the courts of Hun leaders. It was a complex relationship, marked by resentment, dependency, and occasional cooperation. Attila, ever the pragmatist, used the Goths well. His armies at the Catalonian plains included significant numbers of Ostrogothic fighters. These men did not follow him out of loyalty, but out of obligation, or the hope of survival. Yet within their ranks, rebellion brewed. The Battle of Nedao in 454 would see many of these same Gothic tribes rise against the Huns, their former masters, and help bring down the empire. The Gothic revolt after Attila's death was not merely opportunism. It was an assertion of autonomy, the reclaiming of a future that had, for decades, belonged to another's shadow. The Gepids, the Rugians, the Suebi, all joined in. But the Goths played a central role. They understood Hun strategy. They had lived under Hun rule. And now, they turned that knowledge against their former overlords. The result was not just the collapse of Hunnic power, but the emergence of Gothic ambition. Freed from the burden of servitude, the Ostrogoths under Theodoric would soon carve out their own empire in Italy. The Visigoths, already in Gaul and Hispania, solidified their rule. In many ways, they inherited the territories the Huns had once destabilized. But the inheritance was more than geographic. The Goths had learned from the Huns. Not just in tactics, but in politics, the use of mobility, the manipulation of Roman diplomacy, the balancing of barbarian and imperial identities. Theodoric the Great, raised in Constantinople but leading a Gothic people, exemplified this synthesis. His realm combined Roman administration with Gothic tradition, a hybrid born, in part, from the crucible of Hunnic domination. Yet the memory of the Huns lingered. Among the Goths, it was not forgotten how quickly freedom could be lost. Their laws, their chronicles, their settlement patterns all bore the imprint of a people who had once been refugees, then vassals, then rebels. The Huns had given them no gift, only pressure. But in resisting that pressure, the Goths had forged their future. In that mirror, dark and cracked, they had found themselves. In the face of the Hunnic storm, Rome did not stand idle. Though weakened and often reactive, both halves of the empire, East and West, developed responses that were complex, evolving, and sometimes surprisingly effective. These strategies, born out of necessity, offer a window into how an ancient world order struggled to contend with a force it neither fully understood nor could easily defeat. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, faced the Huns most directly. It was along the Danube frontier that the Hun incursions struck hardest in the early 5th century. Initially, the Eastern response was tribute, gold payments meant to forestall raids. This was not cowardice, as some later critics claimed, but a strategic buying of time. The empire was rebuilding after internal conflict and religious upheaval. Gold was a lesser price than war. But the tribute was never the whole plan. By the 440s, the Eastern court under Emperor Theodosius II began a parallel strategy, fortification and reform. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople, completed earlier in the century, were expanded and maintained as the empire's ultimate line of defense. Beyond that, a network of smaller fortresses was built along key river crossings and roads. The empire began to rely increasingly on mobile field armies, smaller, faster units that could harass and slow down invaders without engaging in pitched battle. Diplomacy became another key weapon. The Eastern Romans fostered divisions within the Huns coalition, offering titles, subsidies, and recognition to rival tribes. This policy would bear fruit after Attila's death, when internal strife among his heirs exploded into open rebellion. The empire also supported dissident Gothic groups under Hun control, giving them asylum and, at times, weapons. In the West, where resources were thinner and internal disorder more acute, the response was centered on one man, Flavius Aetius. Aetius, who had lived among the Huns in his youth, understood them in a way no other Roman general did. His diplomacy with Attila was both personal and strategic. For many years, he used the Huns as a counterbalance against internal threats, sending Hun auxiliaries to suppress rival generals, rebellious provincials, or even Visigoths. This bought peace, but at a price, increasing dependence on Attila's goodwill. That balance collapsed in the 450s. When Attila turned westward, Aetius scrambled to build a coalition. The result was the alliance with the Visigoths under Theodoric I, culminating in the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Though tactically indecisive, it was strategically vital. Attila withdrew, and the West, already crumbling, bought a few more years of life. Aetius paid for his pragmatism with his life. In 454, he was murdered by Emperor Valentinian III, the culmination of court intrigue and paranoia. The emperor himself was assassinated shortly thereafter. This left the Western Empire rudderless just as Attila's death created a moment of opportunity. But the West could not seize it. The infrastructure, manpower, and leadership to rebuild were lacking. The Eastern Empire, by contrast, moved swiftly. It ended tribute payments, fortified its borders, and launched campaigns against Hunnic remnants. When Dengizic attacked in 469, he was defeated and killed. Constantinople had learned its lesson. More than anything, the Roman response to the Huns transformed the empire itself. In the East, it catalyzed military reform and redefined the balance of diplomacy and force, lessons that would shape Byzantine policy for centuries. In the West, it revealed the fragility of imperial authority and how quickly it could be replaced by localized, barbarian-led rule. The Huns did not just invade Rome. They forced Rome to change. And in doing so, they helped shape the empires that followed. The death of Attila in 453 marked not just the end of a man, but the unraveling of an entire world system. His empire, so recently the center of fear, diplomacy, and war, dissolved with astonishing speed. Like a canvas stretched too tightly, it tore as soon as the tension slackened. The first cracks appeared among his sons. Elac, the eldest, was meant to inherit the throne. But the empire Attila had built was not designed for inheritance. It had no bureaucracy, no codified succession, no agreed-upon traditions. Its foundation had been personal loyalty to Attila, and with his death, those loyalties shifted. The tribes that had once been allies or subjects, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Rugians, Heruli, sensed opportunity. At the Battle of Nedao in 454, they turned against the Huns. Elac was killed, and the remnants of his following scattered. Dengizic and Ernak tried to maintain control, but unity was lost. Each Hun leader now ruled fragments, drifting camps rather than a state. Some Huns fled eastward, vanishing into the steppes. Others remained on the fringes of the Roman world, seeking alliances or employment. A few, like Ernaka's followers, carved out modest domains along the Danube, eventually absorbed into the Byzantine world or the emerging Bulgar confederations. In a few short years, what had been one of the most feared powers in Europe ceased to exist as a political force. But its collapse did not leave a vacuum, it left a new reality. The Ostrogoths, once subjects of the Huns, now emerged as power players. Under Theodoric the Great, they would later dominate Italy and attempt to rebuild a Western Roman order in Gothic form. The Visigoths solidified their kingdom in Hispania. The Franks began their rise in Gaul. The Burgundians, Suebi, and Vandals claimed their own territories. Rome, by contrast, shrank. The Western Roman Empire, already fragmenting under internal decay and external pressure, limped on until 476, when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. His dethronement by the Germanic general Odo Asa marked the formal end of the Western Empire, though in truth, it had died long before. In the East, the empire endured. Byzantium, inheritor of Rome's mantle, had survived the Hun tempest and emerged hardened. It became more diplomatically nimble, more militarily flexible, and more reliant on gold than glory. The Byzantines would use many of the Hun lessons in their dealings with later steppe powers, the Avars, Bulgars, and eventually, the Turks. For the peoples of Europe, the Hun era left mixed memories. To some, they were monsters, a darkness from the east. To others, especially in Hungary and parts of the steppe, they became ancestors, founders, even heroes. Medieval Hungarian chronicles proudly claim descent from Attila. His name echoed in songs and legends. The devastation of the past became the seed of identity. In historical terms, the Huns reshaped Europe not through long-term rule, but through acceleration. They hastened the migration of peoples, the transformation of empires, and the collapse of old orders. They were a flame, brief but bright, that revealed the cracks in the ancient world and illuminated the paths of what would follow. What Rome called an end, others saw as a beginning. And in that uncertain dawn, the echoes of hooves could still be heard. Long after the words of chroniclers faded and the empires of the Huns crumbled into legend, the earth itself began to speak. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as archaeologists spread across the lands once trampled by Hun cavalry, they uncovered the physical remnants of a vanished power, not in stone palaces or imperial forums, but in burial mounds, weapons, and scattered campsites. The Huns, being a nomadic people, left few architectural traces. Unlike the Romans or Byzantines, they built no enduring cities, no aqueducts or amphitheaters. Their legacy was mobile, ephemeral, but not invisible. In the Carpathian Basin, particularly in Hungary, Romania, and Serbia, archaeologists uncovered graves that bore the hallmarks of Hunnic elite culture. These graves were often rich with goods, gold fibulae, belt buckles, weapons, cauldrons, horse trappings. The dead were buried with their horses, a tradition common among steppe nomads, and in some cases, skulls showed signs of deliberate deformation, a practice used by Huns to mark nobility or group identity. This cranial modification, achieved in infancy, was a cultural signature, and one of the most distinctive markers of Hun influence across Europe. In these burial sites, the fusion of traditions is evident. Roman coins, Gothic jewelry, and Central Asian weapon styles were found together. This mixture illustrates the hybrid world the Huns had created, not purely nomadic, not entirely foreign, but a web of influences drawn from every people they encountered, conquered, or absorbed. One of the most famous archaeological finds linked to the Huns is the Nagasexos treasure, discovered in Hungary. It contained a dazzling array of gold artifacts, including elaborate belt sets and weapon ornaments, likely buried as part of a chieftain's hoard or ceremonial gift. These were not crude trophies, they were masterpieces of metalwork, with refined detail and symbolism that reveal a sophisticated material culture. Beyond burial goods, the layout of Hun camps, though hard to detect, has left its trace. Temporary settlements, arranged by clan or military unit, left subtle impressions in the soil. In some regions, concentrations of horse bones, hearth remains, and scattered tools suggest prolonged occupation. But these were places of pause, not permanence. Perhaps most striking is how far the influence of Hun material culture spread. From the Hungarian plains to the Crimea, from the Danube to the Volga, similar items appear, showing the wide reach of their confederation. Even in Scandinavia, objects influenced by steppe designs begin to appear in the 5th century, a testament to trade, migration, or imitation. Archaeology, in this sense, fills the silence left by Roman pens. The chroniclers were often hostile or confused. They saw the Huns as threats, not subjects to be studied. But the earth records what the ink ignored. It reveals a people who dressed richly, buried their dead with care, and engaged in rituals that bound them to the land and each other. What emerges is a portrait of complexity, a mobile empire with its own elite culture, values, and aesthetics. Not destroyers, but remakers. Not ghosts, but ancestors. Their bones still lie beneath the fields. And in the metal they shaped, the animals they raised, and the traces they left in the soil, the Huns still speak, in the ancient tongue of things that endure. The story of the Huns does not begin or end in Europe alone. To understand them fully, one must place them within a larger continuum, the long history of the Eurasian steppe, that vast belt of grassland stretching from the Danube to the edges of China. The Huns were a chapter in this broader saga, a surge in a tide of movement that had shaped civilizations for millennia. Centuries before the Huns appeared in Roman consciousness, the Xiongnu had roamed the Mongolian steppes, challenging the Han dynasty and forming a confederation that, in many ways, prefigured the Hun Empire. Some scholars argue that the Huns were descended from Xiongnu groups pushed westward after defeats in Asia. Though the link remains debated, there is continuity in tactics, lifestyle, and even language. Nomad confederations like the Xiongnu and Huns did not operate like sedentary states. Their structure was more fluid, often centered around a charismatic leader who held together tribes of varied origin: Turkic, Iranian, Mongolic, Ugric. Loyalty was not to territory, but to person and prestige. This model would repeat throughout history, in the rise of the Gokturks, Khazars, Cumans, and, most famously, the Mongols. The mobility of steppe peoples was their greatest strength. The horse, bred, trained, and revered, allowed them to move faster, strike harder, and retreat swiftly. Their economy, based on herding, required seasonal movement and flexible social units. Their warfare, relying on archery and sudden raids, baffled slower, formation-based armies like Rome's. But the Huns did more than fight. They transmitted goods, ideas, and technologies. Through them passed silk, spices, metalwork, and even religious beliefs. They were not traders in the usual sense, but their migrations connected east and west in ways both destructive and creative. Some Chinese stirrups found their way into Europe in this period. Some Hun belt designs reappeared centuries later in Hungarian and Slavic contexts. The Huns also forced contact between Rome and the deeper steppe. Through their actions, the Roman world became aware of peoples it had only dimly perceived before: Alans, Sarmatians, Avars, and others. And in turn, those peoples learned about the power and weaknesses of empires. In this exchange, the Huns were both transmitters and transformers. Their empire did not survive, but their methods did. Later steppe empires, especially the Avars and early Bulgars, inherited Hunnic tactics and administrative strategies. Even the Mongols, nearly a millennium later, would echo the Huns in their emphasis on mobility, tribute, and the terror of rapid advance. In this way, the Huns serve as a fulcrum, a pivot between East and West, between the ancient and medieval, between isolation and connection. They were not the greatest steppe empire, nor the longest-lived. But they were the first to truly shatter the Roman illusion of invulnerability. And for centuries after, their name would be evoked whenever hoofbeats echoed from the east. A warning. A memory. A part of the eternal rhythm of the steppe. As centuries passed and the dust of history settled, the figure of Attila the Hun began to shift. No longer only a historical person, he became a symbol, molded by the fears, aspirations, and mythologies of many different cultures. Legend took what history could not explain and fashioned from it a character greater, stranger, and more enduring than the man himself. In Western Europe, Attila became the great destroyer, a scourge invoked in sermons, a monster drawn in illuminated manuscripts. For monks chronicling the end of Roman order, he stood not merely as a warlord but as the wrath of heaven made flesh. In some versions, he rode a black horse that left scorched earth in its wake. In others, his very name was spoken in fear, as if to utter it might summon ruin. Yet not all tales were condemnations. In the Germanic Nibelungenlied, Attila appears as Etzel, king of the Huns. Here he is still powerful, still feared, but no longer entirely evil. He plays host to heroes, mourns the betrayal that erupts in his court, and carries the tragic weight of a monarch caught in the violence of men. In this version, Attila becomes a bridge between the old heroic age and the new medieval imagination. Among the Hungarians, Attila's memory was reclaimed with pride. From as early as the 11th century, chronicles began to assert descent from the Huns. The Gesta Hungarorum, a semi-legendary account of the Magyar conquest of the Carpathian Basin, named Attila as a great ancestor, and his descendants as forerunners of the Hungarian people. This identification, though historically tenuous, became a powerful foundation myth. It linked the Magyars to the might and fearlessness of the Huns and gave them a heroic narrative distinct from Latin Christendom. Attila's sword, the Sword of Mars, also entered legend. Said to have been found by a shepherd and given to Attila as a divine sign, it became a talisman of conquest. Later medieval kings, including the German emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, claimed to possess relics of it. To hold the sword of Attila was to inherit his dominion, even if only in legend. His death, too, became enshrouded in mystery. While Priscus and later historians claimed he died of a burst blood vessel on his wedding night, folk tales suggested darker ends, betrayal, poisoning, divine retribution. Some said the earth opened to swallow him, others that his body was buried in secret, along with vast treasure, beneath a river redirected to hide the tomb. These echoes would later inspire treasure hunters and poets alike. Among the steppe peoples, the memory of Attila lingered in song and story. Whether among early Bulgars, Khazars, or later Turkic tribes, his name appeared as a great Khan, a ruler of riders, a figure of awe. Though the Hunnic language vanished, the imprint of his reign was absorbed into the broader mythology of the steppe. In Christian Europe, Attila was both condemned and admired, a barbarian, yes, but also a leader who bowed before the Pope, who spared Rome, who understood the gravity of kingship. In time, he was likened to Alexander, to Caesar, an emblem not of villainy, but of the terrible majesty of fate. By the time of the Renaissance, scholars began to seek the historical Attila again. They combed ancient texts, debated the meanings of names, measured the ruins left behind. But even as they recovered the facts, the myth remained deep, rooted, immortal. Attila had passed. But the shadow he cast walked through time. The departure of the Huns from history did not leave Europe unchanged. Rather, it left it reordered, not only politically, but psychologically and structurally. Like a storm that redraws the coast, their empire's rise and fall reshaped the contours of what came next. The world they had battered did not return to its old form. It adapted, transformed, and hardened in new ways. Most immediately, the vacuum left by the Huns was filled by others. The Germanic tribes, once dispersed, fragmented, often in flight, now settled into permanence. The Visigoths ruled in Hispania, the Ostrogoths would claim Italy, the Franks began their steady ascent in Gaul. These kingdoms did not merely replace Roman provinces, they reimagined them, blending Roman administration with tribal kingship. But beneath their crowns, one still hears the echo of the Hun. The very notion that barbarian leaders could command diplomacy, shape geopolitics, and even negotiate with emperors, these were ideas reinforced by the Hun precedent. Attila had received embassies, dictated treaties, imposed tribute. He had stood, for a moment, on equal footing with Rome. After him, so too would others demand that space. In the East, the Byzantine Empire carried forward Rome's legacy, but with revisions. It learned to negotiate with steppe powers, to use gold and prestige instead of legions alone. The Byzantine strategy of divide and buy, used so effectively in the post-Hun decades, became a long-term imperial tool. The empire would spend the next several centuries balancing Slavs, Avars, Bulgars, Pechenegs, and Turks, a dance of survival first rehearsed with the Huns. The memory of Hunnic terror also left cultural scars. City walls were thickened. Fortifications expanded. Villages were relocated inland or to defensible hills. The open, Roman road-based landscape gave way to a more cautious, enclosed world. Even in literature, one sees the shift from the grand narratives of empire to the more local, moralizing tales of saints, miracles, and divine protection. Religiously, the Huns marked a turning point. The inability of Rome, especially the Western Empire, to protect its flock, to explain the chaos, or to reclaim lost ground, led many to place deeper faith in the Church. Bishops became regional leaders. Monasteries grew in importance. The Church did not merely survive the Hun tempest, it grew stronger, in part because of it. In the Carpathian Basin and beyond, the collapse of Hunnic rule fragmented power for a time. New federations emerged. The Gepids flourished briefly, then fell. The Avars would come next, and later, the Magyars. All would inherit something of the Huns, their tactics, their memory, and in some cases, their names. The region became a permanent frontier, a zone where East and West would meet and contest for centuries. Trade routes shifted too. With the Hun Empire gone, some steppe corridors fell silent, others reopened. Silk, amber, furs, and slaves once again flowed from east to west, but now under different hands, with different tolls and terms. The Huns had disrupted the ancient networks, but they had also revealed their value. In the centuries to come, the Silk Road would expand its reach, and Europe's gaze would turn ever eastward. In this reordered world, the Huns were no longer present, but they were still felt. As a warning. As a precedent. As a force that had once bent the world, however briefly, in a new direction. Their empire was gone. But the imprint remained. While the memory of the Huns faded in Europe, in the East, across the endless stretches of steppe, desert, and mountain, their legacy continued in subtler, but no less potent, forms. The Hun eruption into Europe was not an isolated event, but part of a larger east-to-west dynamic that had shaped Inner Asia for millennia. In this broader theatre, the Huns were neither the first nor the last. Before them had come the Xiongnu, whose long struggle with the Han dynasty defined the frontier politics of ancient China. Many scholars have noted parallels between these northern horse lords and the Huns, similar mobility, elite burial customs, even linguistic hints. Though the exact genealogical links are debated, the structural similarity is undeniable and instructive. The idea of the mobile empire, held together by personal allegiance, tribute, and elite marriage alliances, did not die with the Huns. It was replicated and refined by their successors. In the 6th century, the Gokturks rose to power in Central Asia, forging an empire that stretched from Manchuria to the Caspian. Like the Huns, they emphasized mounted warfare, diplomacy, and flexible tribal coalitions. Unlike the Huns, their leadership carried spiritual weight. Khans were not merely military chiefs but semi-divine figures, blessed by heaven's mandate, the Khat. From the Gokturks came the Khazars, who would dominate the steppe north of the Black Sea. They would later engage with Byzantium and the emerging Slavic world, acting as middlemen in the trade routes between East and West. Though not direct heirs of the Huns, the Khazars inherited their position in the geographic and political order of the steppe. Their capital, Itil, stood not far from where Hunnic power once had sway. Further east, the memory of steppe unity would culminate in the rise of the Mongols in the 13th century. Genghis Khan's empire dwarfed Attila's in scale and organization, but the conceptual framework, mobile governance, diplomacy rooted in fear and tribute, cross-cultural administration, bore striking resemblance to earlier models. The Mongols, too, used terror strategically, not only to conquer but to compel obedience. Even in China, where the Huns never reached directly, the echoes were felt. Chinese dynasties studied the tactics of nomadic confederations, adapted cavalry strategies, and learned to deal with mobile threats not through brute force, but through diplomacy, gifts, and marriages. The steppe had changed the way empires were run, and the Huns had played their part in that transformation. The presence of artificial cranial deformation in Central Asian burials, the shared use of composite bows, and the burial of horses alongside warriors, all point to a cultural continuity that transcended language and ethnicity. It was the steppe way, and the Huns had lived it fully. In this vast continuum, the Huns served not as an anomaly, but as a vital link. They brought the steppe into direct contact with the heart of the Roman world. And though they were defeated, their legacy flowed backward, into Asia, where it mingled with the fates of other nomads, and forward, into the practices of new powers yet to rise. They were not only a European experience. They were part of a Eurasian story. One of movement. One of exchange. One of empires on horseback, whose thunder echoed across continents. Time has not been kind to the truth of the Huns. As centuries passed and the ancient world gave way to the medieval and modern, the image of the Huns was twisted, caricatured, simplified. The real people, the nomads who built an empire, the horsemen who reshaped Europe, faded behind a veil of myth, fear, and deliberate distortion. Much of this misunderstanding began with Roman and Christian chroniclers, who, writing from the cities the Huns had threatened or sacked, portrayed them through lenses of horror. Ammianus Marcellinus, Jordanes, and others described the Huns in monstrous terms: flat-faced, beast-like, barely human. Their lifestyle was ridiculed, their language said to be bestial, their customs primitive. Such portrayals served a purpose. They reinforced Roman self-image. To cast the Huns as creatures of chaos helped justify Roman failures, and later, Christian victories. If Attila was the scourge of God, then his defeat was divine mercy, not merely the product of diplomacy, disease, or overreach. This framing was useful, but it also robbed the Huns of their complexity. Modern scholarship, however, has begun to peel back those distortions. Archaeology, comparative anthropology, and linguistics have revealed a different picture, one of a people who were neither demonic nor directionless, but strategic, adaptive, and deeply embedded in the currents of their time. They were not simply destroyers. They built alliances, negotiated treaties, and maintained order within their confederation. They balanced diverse ethnic groups, managed tribute flows, and projected power with efficiency. They were not cultureless, they had rituals, hierarchies, and an aesthetic visible in their burial customs and metalwork. Even the oft-cited cruelty of the Huns must be contextualized. Warfare in late antiquity was brutal for all sides. Roman generals massacred prisoners, burned cities, and enslaved populations. The difference was one of perspective. The Romans wrote their own history, while the Huns left few written words of their own. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the Huns returned again, this time as metaphors. During World War I, German soldiers were dubbed Huns by Allied propaganda, invoking images of barbarity and savagery. It was a deliberate association, meant to dehumanize. Attila's name was resurrected not as a figure of historical interest, but as a shorthand for cruelty. This rhetorical legacy lingers even now. To call someone a Hun remains an insult in some cultures, a word stripped of context, heavy with accusation. But beneath the stereotype lies a reality far richer than the label suggests. In truth, the Huns were a part of Europe's story, not merely its nightmare. They interacted with Romans, married into noble families, employed Roman engineers and scribes. They navigated the same questions of power, loyalty, and survival that all peoples faced in that turbulent age. They were not aliens to civilization. They were one of its many forms. A form that moved on horseback, that struck swiftly, that vanished quickly, but that, for a time, held the fate of empires in its grasp. In recent years, advances in genetic research have opened new doors to understanding the peoples of the past, and the Huns, once buried under layers of myth and misinformation, have begun to re-emerge in this scientific light. Their bones, uncovered in ancient cemeteries from Hungary to Kazakhstan, speak with a clarity no chronicler could offer. DNA analysis of remains attributed to the Huns confirms what historians have long suspected: they were not a single, uniform people. Rather, they were a coalition, a mixture of East Asian, Central Asian, and European genetic backgrounds. This diversity aligns with the historical portrait of the Huns as a confederation of tribes, held together not by blood, but by allegiance, necessity, and shared leadership. Some individuals buried with elite Hunnic artifacts show predominantly East Asian ancestry, likely descended from populations farther east, perhaps near Mongolia or the Altai Mountains. Others show blended ancestry, combining Eastern and Western Eurasian traits, while some, especially among lower status graves, appear almost entirely European. This suggests a layered society, one in which steppe elites governed over or absorbed local populations. The practice of cranial deformation, once thought to be a Hunnic hallmark, appears in both East and West, among individuals of different backgrounds. This reinforces the idea that cultural identity in the Hunnic world was adopted and displayed, not inherited strictly through bloodlines. To have an elongated skull was to belong, to signal elite status, or loyalty, or perhaps to embody a shared spiritual or aesthetic ideal. Isotope analysis, which reveals where a person grew up based on water and food consumed in youth, also adds depth. Some Hunnic warriors were born on the steppe, raised among herders and horsemen. Others were born in the Roman provinces, possibly children of Gothic, Alan, or Sarmatian mothers, later folded into the Hun Confederation. The result is a map not of conquest alone, but of integration. This multi-ethnic reality helps explain the flexibility and adaptability of the Huns. It also shows why they were so hard to resist. They could speak to many peoples, command many kinds of warriors, and exploit many landscapes. In a time when identity was often local, the Huns were cosmopolitan, though not in the city-dwelling sense, but in the vast, borderless world of the steppe. It also reminds us of a deeper truth, that nations, tribes, and empires are not frozen entities. They shift, absorb, adapt. The Huns were not simply horsemen from the east, they were the children of migration, of collision, of adaptation. They were made in the forge of movement. Today, descendants of the peoples the Huns once ruled still walk the lands they once crossed. In Hungary, in Romania, in the Volga region, genetic threads remain, not as pure Hunnic lines, but as echoes within a broader human tapestry. Science, like archaeology and history, gives back to the Huns what time and myth had obscured: their humanity. Their faces, once twisted into caricatures by frightened scribes, are now being reconstructed, not in fear, but in recognition. They were many peoples, but they shared one path. And that path changed the world. While the Huns are often remembered for their warfare, it was their diplomacy, quiet, shrewd, and persistent, that allowed them to endure and to thrive as long as they did. They did not merely take by force. They demanded, negotiated, and manipulated. Their envoys spoke in many tongues, understood the intricacies of Roman court politics, and moved through embassies as deftly as their warriors moved on horseback. This was not diplomacy in the modern sense. There were no fixed treaties bound by parchment and witnessed by notaries. Rather, the Hun approach to diplomacy was fluid, constantly shifting, rooted in performance, ceremony, and the art of psychological dominance. At the heart of this diplomatic theatre stood Attila. He received Roman envoys in carefully curated settings, calculated to impress and intimidate. Priscus, the Eastern Roman historian who visited Attila's court, describes the contrast: Roman ambassadors dressed in silk, anxious and deferential; Attila, austere, plain in dress, yet commanding the space. Power, in Hun diplomacy, was not shown in gold, but in control. The embassies often revolved around tribute. The Eastern Roman Empire paid gold annually, and Attila ensured those payments came with gestures of subordination. If a shipment was delayed, or the gold light in weight, the threat of invasion followed. Sometimes he returned Roman envoys humiliated, sending a clear message: Hun supremacy would not be questioned. But Attila also used diplomacy to sow division. He played the Western and Eastern courts against one another, promising peace to one while pressuring the other. He offered protection to rebel generals, gave sanctuary to dissidents, and then used those relationships as leverage. When the Eastern court supported dissident Huns, Attila launched his 447 campaign deep into the Balkans. When the West denied him a marriage alliance, he invaded Gaul. Marriage, indeed, was one of his most calculated tools. His demand to marry Honoria, sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III, was framed as both political and personal. Though likely a ploy to gain a claim on imperial territory, it was couched in the language of dynastic alliance, a tactic Rome had used for centuries. That Attila used it in turn showed how well he understood the empire's own game. Envoys like Maximinus and Priscus, sent from Constantinople, were not mere messengers, they were instruments of perception. Their presence validated Attila's position as a legitimate power. They were expected to watch, report, and, subtly, to bow. Their accounts, though colored by Roman bias, reveal how much respect and caution Hun diplomacy commanded. It was also a diplomacy of hostages. Roman sons sent to the Hun court were not simply guarantees, they were future allies, Roman in blood, but Hunnic in loyalty. Attila himself was said to have grown up with Roman influence, and Flavius Aetius, his great rival, had once been a hostage among the Huns. These exchanges created a shared class of men, fluent in both worlds, who shaped the frontier's fate. When diplomacy failed, war followed, but rarely without warning. Attila sent letters, made demands, set deadlines. He understood the value of appearing reasonable, even generous, before unleashing destruction. This too was strategy. When Rome finally yielded, it did so with relief, not rage. The Huns had not only won, they had maintained the appearance of justice. In this, they outplayed many of their enemies. For the empire of the Huns may have moved with the winds, but it was grounded in calculation. A bow could bend. So too could policy. And in the bending, empires broke. Though often seen as foreign to the religious world of Rome, the Huns lived within a complex spiritual landscape, one shaped by animism, ancestor worship, and the unseen rhythms of the steppe. Their religion was not codified in scripture nor structured by temples. It was older, deeper, embedded in the sky above, the wind on the plain, and the movements of stars and horses. Roman and Byzantine observers describe the Huns as irreligious, even godless, but this stemmed from misunderstanding. The Huns did not build visible places of worship or practice organized liturgy. Instead, their spirituality was oral, intuitive, and communal. The sacred was not confined to walls. It was lived. Central to Hunnic belief was Tungri, the sky god. Though not directly named in surviving Hunnic sources, the concept of a celestial deity governing fate, war, and kingship was widespread among steppe cultures. The Khan ruled not just by force, but by the will of heaven. This belief imbued Attila's reign with divine sanction. Victories were signs of approval, defeats, omens of misalignment. Nature spirits, ancestral souls, and shamanistic rites were also part of this world. Shamans, figures who bridged the physical and spiritual realms, likely guided rituals, interpreted dreams, and performed healings. These rituals may have involved drumming, trance, or animal sacrifice, especially of horses, creatures sacred across the steppe. The burial customs of the Huns also reflect religious meaning. Elite burials included grave goods, sacrificed animals, and careful orientation, possibly aligned with celestial events or symbolic directions. Some graves contained amulets and objects thought to hold protective power, signs of a belief in the afterlife or spirit world. Interestingly, within the Hunnic Empire, religious diversity was tolerated and even incorporated. Gothic Christians lived among the Huns, some as warriors, others as scribes. So too did pagans, Zoroastrians, and followers of local cults. The Huns did not impose their beliefs, nor did they persecute others for theirs. This pragmatism allowed them to govern a multicultural realm with minimal religious friction. Yet even among the Huns, Christianity began to find quiet footholds. Some members of Attila's court were Christian, including scribes and advisors, and contacts with the Roman world brought exposure to Christian ideas. However, no evidence suggests mass conversions, or that Attila himself ever embraced the cross. To Rome, this remained a point of unease. A world power that did not acknowledge the Christian God was, by definition, suspect. And thus, the Huns were often cast in the language of the diabolical, invaders from beyond the moral order, sent as punishment or proof of the end times. But the truth was more nuanced. The Huns had their own sacred order, one rooted in place, ancestry, and power. Their rituals may have been invisible to Roman chroniclers, but they were real and meaningful. On the frontier where empires met, gods did not disappear. They simply spoke different tongues. And in the wind-whipped silence of the steppe, the Huns listened, not for sermons, but for signs. Though the Huns left no temples or written poetry, their shadow loomed large in the creative memory of Europe. From medieval manuscripts to Renaissance epics, from operas to nationalist paintings, Attila and his horsemen galloped across the canvas of imagination, ever shifting in form, hero, villain, barbarian, ancestor. In the earliest depictions, the Huns were figures of horror. Illuminated manuscripts from the early Middle Ages show them with wild eyes, unkempt hair, and monstrous faces, visual extensions of the fear they had once inspired. They are portrayed storming cities, burning villages, scattering priests, chaos incarnate. These images reinforced Christian morality plays, where the sins of a fallen Rome were punished by the fury of the East. But as time passed, the portrayal softened, evolved. In the Germanic Nibelungenlied, Attila appears not as a demon but as Etzel, a noble and tragic king. His court becomes the stage for betrayal and bloodshed, but he himself is not the villain. This literary reimagining transformed Attila from an outsider to a figure embedded in the heroic tradition of Europe, a king among kings, shaped by honor and grief. The Renaissance rediscovered Attila through classical texts. Scholars like Petrarch and later historians revisited Priscus and Jordanes. Artists depicted his meeting with Pope Leo I, the moment when Attila, towering on horseback, is halted by divine authority. Raphael's famous fresco in the Vatican captures this scene. Attila, regal and mighty, is not overthrown, but persuaded. It is art as theology, but also as diplomacy. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Huns were reborn in opera and national myth. Verdi's Attila, 1846, presents the Hun king as a man of destiny, torn between ambition and fate. Here, the conqueror becomes a tragic hero, a product of divine will, not brute savagery. The opera, written amid the nationalist ferment of Italy, reflected its time. Attila stood for both foreign invasion and native resistance, depending on the viewer. Among the Magyars of Hungary, the Huns became more than history, they became forebears. In national epics, Attila was not the enemy of Rome, but the patriarch of the Hungarian people. Medieval chronicles like the Gesta Hungarorum wove his legacy into the story of Arpad and the Magyar conquest. In this vision, the Huns were civilizers, not destroyers, founders of a rightful homeland. Painters followed suit. Romantic-era canvases often depicted Attila as a majestic warlord, surrounded by fire and sky, gazing westward as if glimpsing empire. These works were not accurate portraits, but emotional invocations, symbols of strength, wildness, and primordial power. In modern times, popular culture has further transformed the Hun image. In films and fantasy, they appear as warlike nomads, their style borrowed and reshaped by creators seeking a shorthand for the fierce and the foreign. Yet the distortion often persists, the Hun as brute, as savage, as one-dimensional threat. This reveals less about the Huns themselves, and more about the anxieties of those who imagine them. For the Huns were never simple. They were not blank invaders, but a people with language, belief, strategy, and style, a mobile civilization in its own right. And every image, every story, every myth about them is also a reflection of the world that created it. What survives is not the truth alone, but the echo of awe. In the long arc of history, the Huns offer more than a tale of conquest and collapse. They offer a perspective, a lens through which to view the fragility of civilizations and the power of movement. Their story, though brief in years, holds enduring truths about the dynamics of power, adaptation, and the limits of empires. First among these is the lesson of mobility. The Huns thrived not by building static cities, but by mastering the rhythms of the land. Their warriors could cross rivers, forests, and mountains with speed unknown to their adversaries. They did not require roads or supply lines in the Roman sense. Their sustenance was their herds, their strength was their cohesion, and their strategy was one of unpredictability. In contrast, Rome, for all its engineering and discipline, was rigid. Its armies moved slowly, its defenses were fixed, and its sense of security was tied to boundaries that the Huns simply ignored. The lesson here is not one of superiority, but of contrast, that adaptability often triumphs where structure fails. Secondly, the Huns reveal the potency of hybrid leadership. Attila ruled not only Huns, but Goths, Alans, Sarmatians, and others. His empire was stitched together from fragments, maintained not through law but through loyalty, tribute, and fear. It was fragile, yes, but effective. He understood that control did not require assimilation. Diversity, if managed well, could be a source of strength. In our modern world, where borders shift and identities blend, this aspect of Hunnic rule is particularly resonant. Unity, the Huns remind us, need not mean uniformity. Third, the Huns illuminate the role of perception in history. Their image was largely shaped by others, by Roman pens, Christian sermons, and later national myths. They were, in many accounts, demons because it suited the narrators. But the truth of skilled diplomacy, complex alliances, and ritual life persisted beneath the surface. From this, we learn the importance of questioning received narratives. To see clearly, we must sift between fear and fact, myth and material. Lastly, the Huns teach us about impermanence. Their rise was meteoric, their fall sudden. They conquered vast regions, threatened mighty empires, and then vanished. No ruins mark their capital, no dynasty bears their name. But their influence, on migration, on military strategy, on the psyche of Europe, endured. History remembers them not for what they built, but for what they moved. Peoples. Boundaries. Ideas. In the silence that followed their passing, the world rearranged itself. And that, perhaps, is their greatest legacy, not an empire, but a transformation. The Huns did not last. But they changed what did. In the quiet that followed the Huns' fall, the lands they once ruled exhaled. Cities rebuilt. Borders redrew themselves. Kingdoms rose where camps had stood. Yet though the horse hooves no longer echoed, the memory of that thunder remained, in stone, in song, in the caution etched into the walls of empires. The Huns, for all their terror, were not eternal. They did not leave behind a Rome, a Constantinople, or a Baghdad. No marble columns bear their names. No texts written in their own hand survive. And yet, they are not forgotten. Their absence's presence, a silence so loud it reshaped the world that followed. They had ridden from the east, swift and unseen, striking like lightning across the plains. They moved like no enemy had moved. They fought not just with weapons, but with fear, with rumor, with reputation. Their leaders read men as much as maps, and their greatest weapon was not the bow, but unpredictability. And when they vanished, they left behind a changed Europe. An empire humbled. Tribes emboldened. A church strengthened. A world no longer sure of its center. From their steppe homeland to the banks of the Loire, their passage was not a tale of one people alone. It was a collision of cultures, of Rome and the wild, of script and silence, of structure and storm. And from that collision, new forms were born, Gothic kingdoms, Byzantine resilience, the early outlines of what would become medieval Christendom. Attila, the man at the center of the storm, lives on not in tomb or temple, but in echo. His name became myth, warning, symbol. To some, he was destruction, to others, a necessary fire through which the old world passed. And the Huns themselves, mysterious, many-tongued, elusive, remain a mirror. They reflect not only their time, but ours. They show how history can be shaped by those who leave no record, how fear can shape memory, and how even the briefest empires can cast the longest shadows. Today, their legacy lingers. In the steppe winds that still race across Eurasia. In the patterns of migration that still shape nations. In the deep instinct that borders, however strong, may yet shift. For the Huns were not a people of permanence. They were a force of change. And long after their horses cease to ride, the earth remembers their passing. Not in monuments, but in motion.